So, good morning, everyone. My name is Joseph Kearney, and it is a great privilege for me as Dean of Marquette University Law School to welcome you to Eckstein Hall. For the ordinary event at the law school, we are not just the host, but the convener. That is, typically, we are the entity that has done all the hard work in putting the program together. Today's event, by contrast, is a little different. This is a conference on urban men in poverty, and I am tempted to say that we are getting smarter. We have passed off the hard work onto someone else. The more precise characterization is that this is the Spring Symposium of the University of Wisconsin, La Follette School of Public Affairs, and Marquette University Law School is the La Follette School's partner in presenting this symposium. We are very grateful for this opportunity. We are after the hard problems here at the law school, and only by forging partnerships across campuses, between universities, among government, industry, educators, and many others, only through such collaboration, to use the word that our mutual friend Shel Lubar often invokes, only in this way do any of us really have a hope of effectively addressing some of these hard problems. In fact, I expect Marquette University's president, Mike Lovell, to come along mid-morning and to extend his own greetings on behalf of the university. That's how important we think this topic to be. That's how grateful we are to be partnering with the La Follette School, and that's how pleased we are that all of you are here with us today. Beyond that, I really regard myself as having the responsibility only of welcoming Susan Webb-Yackey, who is the director of the La Follette School of Public Affairs. She and her colleagues have been terrific partners in this. They are most welcome partners here, even beyond today, I would imagine and hope. So please welcome Dr. Yackey.
Thank you, Dean Kearney, and let me add my welcome on behalf of the faculty, the staff, the students of the University of Wisconsin at Madison's La Follette School of Public Affairs. I'm Susan Yackey. I'm the director of the La Follette School, where I also have a faculty appointment. I'm very proud to be the director of the La Follette School, and I'm very proud of this new partnership with the Marquette Law School. I want to thank Dean Kearney in particular for extending a hand on this very important issue. And I want to recognize his staff and mine for all the hard work that they've put into making this event a success. I also want to acknowledge the work that Marquette University is doing more broadly in its Near West Side Partnership, which holds the prospect of bettering nearby neighborhoods that easily parallel the issues that we're discussing today. When our La Follette faculty met at its retreat last August, and we discussed the theme that we should have for our 2015 policy symposium, it was an easy call: the debilitating and crippling grip of poverty. Once we got that far, the poverty experts on our faculty, and there are many, took over to refine the problem. Let me take a moment to acknowledge one of those La Follette faculty members by name now. It's Jeffrey Wallace, our conference organizer. You're going to hear from Jeffrey soon. Jeffrey is a native of Milwaukee, an economist, and an excellent policy scholar. He was the logical choice to lead our emerging discussions today. Today, we're going to focus on what we know, as well as what we don't know, about the situation affecting low-wage and low-income men. And from that theme emerge some of the questions outlined in your agenda today. To save time and to allow questions for our speakers, I want to introduce each of them now. First, we have Professor Jeffrey Wallace of the La Follette School. He's going to give us a national overview and some new specific figures about poverty, both in Wisconsin as well as Milwaukee. Next, we have polling expert and Marquette law professor Charles Franklin. He's going to give us some insight into what the data can tell us about the problem. After a short break, Professor Pate of UW-Milwaukee's Department of Social Work will talk about his work on early life developments. Following that, Mike Mazzolia, sorry Mike, from UW-Madison's Sociology Department is going to tell us about the social consequences of incarceration. And finally, Harry Holzer, a longtime friend of the La Follette School of Public Affairs and a Georgetown professor, is going to give us some ideas for how to move forward from here. So without further ado, let me welcome all of our speakers with a round of applause, and let's begin.
Well, thanks for coming. What I'm going to talk about today is, first of all, the case for focusing on male poverty, but judging by the audience, that's already been made. I'm going to talk a little bit about poverty measurement. I'm going to talk about male poverty at the national level. I'm going to provide characteristics of those at risk for poverty, and I'm also going to talk about the characteristics of poor men. And additionally, I'm going to talk a little bit about income sources and other resources that are available to poor men and their families. I'm going to, one of the things that we have at the La Follette School and at IRP is the Wisconsin Poverty Report that's put together by our colleague Tim Smeeting and some others. I'm going to mention some highlights of that report, and then I'm going to conclude. So why focus on men? I think that there's two big reasons to focus on men. One is that there's spillovers. So what do I mean by this? I mean that the economic circumstances of men affect the well-being of women and children. And that happens in a number of ways. One way is marriage. So we know that male socioeconomic status affects the marital prospects of women, and that in turn has the ability to affect child poverty and also female poverty, because people that are in married couple families are much less likely to be poor than people that are in other family structures. Child support. The economic status of men affects the ability of men to provide support for their non-custodial children, and that in turn affects the resources that are available to them and their economic status. And even outside of non-custodial children, men are an important source of family income. So as we'll see today, 40% of men live with children, and 1/3 of poor men live with children. So another reason to focus on men is that there's some troubling trends for less educated men, and particularly black men. So one of these troubling trends is a mass retreat from employment for less skilled men. If we can look at annual employment rates, so this is like, did you work in the last year? In 2000, if we look at men ages 18 to 64 with a high school education or less, 84% of them worked. If we look at black men ages 18 to 64 with a high school education or less, 73% of them worked in the calendar year. If we go to 2013, so this is 14 years later, that rate for 18 to 64-year-old men with a high school education or less dropped from 84% to 73%. And if we focus on black men in that less educated group, it falls from 73 to 58%. So that's a lot of men that aren't attached to the labor market in any way over the course of a year. Another reason to focus on men is that less skilled men have seen their earnings decline substantially. So we see a 20% decline in median wages for men without a high school diploma between 1990 and 2013, and a 13% decline for men that have a high school degree or some college. So we're just talking about men who show up in survey data now. The survey data don't capture the institutionalized population, obviously don't capture people that aren't living anymore. And there's also this kind of problem that's just been in the news in the last few days of disappearing men. So we know that for every 100 black women ages 25 to 54, there are only 83 black men. So where are the other guys? Well, the simple answer to that question is they're either not alive anymore or they're incarcerated and institutionalized. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about poverty measurement. Not too long, hopefully. So we have an official poverty measure, and then we have something that's available after 2009 2009 called the Supplemental Poverty Measure. The official poverty measure, so there's a bunch of things you need to do if you're going to come up with a poverty measure. One thing you need to do is you need to find what the resource sharing unit is. And with the official measure, that's going to be families, and then unrelated individuals are treated separately. So if I and my wife had a son and his girlfriend was living with us, that would be a family of 3 and then a separate unrelated individual. We also need to figure out what a threshold is if we're going to define a poverty measure. And for the official measure, it's 3 times the cost of a minimum food diet in 1963. And then that's updated for inflation every year and adjusted for family size. And then we also need to figure out what resources we're going to count. If we look at the official measure, it's gross before tax cash income. So importantly, we're not counting transfers that come through the tax system, and those are increasingly important source of support for low-income individuals and families. And we're also not counting in-kind transfers, things like food stamps, housing assistance, energy assistance, school lunch. So the supplemental measure was designed to deal with a number of problems with the official measure. One of the things that it does is it expands the concept of what the resource sharing unit is. So under the supplemental measure, it's all people that live in the same address that are related, but also including cohabitors and unrelated children. So if we go back to that example of myself and my wife, my son, his girlfriend, and maybe her child, whereas that would have been a family, that would have been 2 families, one of size 3 and another one of size 2. Now we're going to be one family of size 5. And we're all presumed to be sharing resources. The poverty threshold for the supplemental measure is based on expenditures on food, clothing, shelter, and utilities for families with exactly 2 children that are between the 30th and 36th percentile of expenditures. So we kind of look at families at the kind of the bottom end of expenditures and then figure out what they spend, and that's how the threshold is created, and then it's time multiplied by 1.2 to account for a little bit extra. It's adjusted over time using 5-year moving average. So each year, a new year will come in and an old year will go out. So it can change over time. And then importantly, if we look at what the resource measure is, it's much broader than it is under the official measure. It includes cash income, but it also includes non-cash benefits, so things like food stamps, energy assistance, housing assistance, school lunch program stuff. We subtract out taxes, add in tax credits, and there's also deductions for expenses. Importantly, expenses associated with employment, so work expenses, out-of-pocket medical expenses. And so I'm bringing this up because I'm not going to focus on the official measure at all. Everything I talk about today will be with respect to the supplemental measure. So I just want us to be clear on what I mean by poverty. Okay, so if we think about pros and cons of these measures, and I just alluded to some of them, but basically the pros of the supplemental measure, it has a broader definition of the resource sharing unit that includes cohabitors. Another huge one is that it's affected by the policy levers that are currently used to assist low-income families and individuals. So all these things that have become increasingly important over the last 40 or 50 years, like the earned income tax credit, like food stamps, like housing assistance, are all levers that can reduce poverty under the supplemental measure, but that are not going to reduce poverty under the official measure. Cons, it's not available before 2009, and for this reason, we can't, we're not officially available before 2009, and it's hard to make comparisons over time. But we're going to look at kind of point-in-time stuff today, in particular 2013. Okay, so the first point I want to make is that overall, if we look at male poverty rates, they're low relative to other groups. So as we move across here, we have children, women, kind of prime-age women age 18 to 64, women over 65, men 18 to 64, and men over 65. And so just a quick note for those of you who are used to seeing child poverty rates at or above 20%. We're at a little bit over 16% here. And primarily the reason for that is because this is the supplemental measure and not the official measure. And with the supplemental measure, we're counting all these resources that are targeted primarily at families with children. So it tends to reduce child poverty more than it does, or it reduces child poverty but increases poverty for perhaps other groups. So we can see men are, especially in this prime age group, do not have high poverty rates relative to other groups. But there are some men that are at fairly high risk for poverty, and so I want to highlight who those folks are. In particular, if we look at central city residents, they have poverty rates near 20%, much higher than the other geographically defined areas. So they're at high risk, and I'm just going to focus on the men 18 to 64 for the rest of the talk. Young men, they also have high poverty rates, above 20%, much higher than the other age groups. So we've highlighted two groups already, central city men, young men. Blacks and Hispanics, much higher poverty rates than other groups. Both above 20%. In the case of Hispanics, nearly 25%. High school dropouts. So this is a group that's 30% of this group is poor. But it's also the case that men that just have a high school diploma have a fairly high poverty rate as well. And we could look also across different types of family structures. So we have married couple families, cohabitating families. So that's any family that's not headed by a married couple where there's a cohabiter or a cohabitating couple in there. So we used the example before. I guess that would be a cohabitating family, myself, or actually, if it were me and my son and his girlfriend, we would call it a cohabitating family. Male-headed families, female-headed families, and then male non-family individuals. And we can see the last three groups in particular, the male-headed families, the female-headed families, and the non-family men, all have fairly high rates of poverty. Work and poverty go hand in hand. So if you're not working at all, so we talked about the increasing share of men that report not working in a calendar year. Well, they have extremely high rates of poverty by this SPM measure at 35%. And then working less than full-time full year, also fairly high rates of poverty at above 20%. If we look at guys who are working full-time full year, they're not very likely to be poor. So this is, of all the groups you could pick out, like this is the group with the lowest poverty rate. Okay, so next I want to talk about, so that was kind of like looking at the whole population and saying, well, what's, you know, what fraction of folks or what percentage of folks in that population are poor. I next want to focus on just the kind of the group of poor men and describe what their characteristics are. So I want to talk about their composition or their makeup. So we do get some hints about this from examining poverty rates. However, we could have a group with a high poverty rate, but it represents a low overall share of the population, and it's not going to comprise a very large share of the poor. We could also have a group with a low poverty rate, but it represents a large share of the population, and it could end up comprising a large share of the poor. So there are some differences between these kind of views. And so we're going to look more closely at this. In particular, we're going to look at what characteristics these men have and what sort of living arrangements they're in. Distribution of poor men across locations. So it's going to be the case that at least 75% of poor men live in central cities or other metro areas. So when we talk about male poverty, it is a metropolitan phenomenon primarily. We talk about the distribution across racial groups. So this is one of those cases where we know that poverty rates among white men aren't that high, but they represent a large share of the population. So they represent a large share of poor men. That being said, blacks and Hispanics, we know they have high poverty rates, but they represent a low share of the population. But together, they're nearly half the poor, but about only 30% of the population. So they're disproportionately overrepresented in the pool of poor men. Education level, not surprisingly, if we look at poor men, not very many of them have a college degree or more. Most of them fall into this category of less than a high school education or just a high school diploma with no college. It's about 2/3. Across family types, this is another case where married couple families are like 60%. 60% of men are in married couple families in this age group. So they're going to represent a large share of poor men, or poor men in these families are going to represent a large share. But but where they make up 60% of the population, they're only 37.8% of poor men. And these other groups, which make up much smaller shares of the population but have much higher poverty rates, are going to make up a disproportionate share of poor men. So in particular, the male non-family men, 30%. Men and female-headed families, 11.7% of poor men, and men and male-headed families, 11.4% of poor men. So there's we mentioned before, a big linkage between employment and being poor. And if we look at poor men, it's the case that 47.3% of them didn't work in the calendar year 2013. And then another 30.2% worked less than full-time full year, and merely 22.5% were working full-time full year. So we could say that most of these guys are either unemployed over a calendar year or underemployed in the course of a calendar year. So there's a lot of heterogeneity within this group, and I want to highlight that though. So if we look at just the young guys, we get a little bit different picture. So these are just the 18 to 24-year-olds, and we still have like about half of them, or a little over half of them, not working at 50.8, and then a larger share of them working but not working full-time full year, and a much smaller share of them working full-time full year. And this is because these guys tend to be men that aren't in families. So in terms of the resource sharing unit, they're on their own. And if they are working full-time full year, well, they're likely earning enough to not be poor. So that's why that working full-time full year is such a small share here, where it wasn't for the group as a whole. We do know something about what they're doing if they're not working. So for this group, the 50.8% that aren't working, there's a breakdown of what they were doing. So 33.6% were going to school, enrolled in school during the year they weren't working, or that was their primary reason for not working. Another 7.7 said they could not find work, and then there's a bunch of other reasons that are in there, like you could be taking care of a family or home, or be disabled, and those account for 9.3%. So this is the young men. If we look at the older group of men, so the 25 to 64-year-olds, we get a very different picture. So again, about half of them are not working. About another quarter are working less than full-time full year. and then a much larger share working full-time, full year. So again, these are guys that are more likely to be in resource sharing units that are larger than one. So they're going to have a higher threshold that they need to achieve in order to be out of poverty. So them working full-time, full year might not be enough to pull the sharing unit out of being poor. We also get a very different picture of what's going on when they're not working during the calendar year. So in this case, ill or disabled accounts for 20.1%. So a little less than half of the 46.2%. And then not being able to find work also figures prominently at 8.3%, and then others 17.9%. If we focus exclusively on black men, the not working piece of the pie grows a lot bigger at the expense of working less than full-time, full year. And these two other categories, when people aren't working, gain in importance, in particular the ill and disabled, and also the could not find work. So that's like 2/3 of the guys that aren't working full-time, full year, and are poor say that they're disabled or that they have difficulty finding work. And we know, this is a significant share of this population is going to be ex-offenders. So that might be that might have something to do with the can't find work. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the resources available to poor men, and I'm going to mention 3 cases. So if we think about these designations, they roughly split a group of poor men into thirds. So the first is poor non-family men. So that's just guys that are in a resource sharing unit of 1 on their own. And then there's poor men and families without children. So I'm living with my mother. We're a family of 2, and we're poor, but I don't have any kids that are living there, and I'm not cohabitating. And then poor men in families with children. So this would include cohabitators, but they have to have a child. It doesn't have to be their child. Okay, so there's a lot of information here, so I just want to talk through it. What we have here are the different sorts of resources. So we could have total cash income, and that can be composed potentially of earnings, and then there's earnings and earnings of others. Of course, here we're focusing on non-family men, so there are no other earnings. We have other sources of cash income would be UI, unemployment insurance, welfare, and supplemental security income. And then other cash transfers, so there's a lot of different things that the other cash transfers could be. It could be Social Security, it could be disability, it could be workers' compensation, it could be educational assistance, it could be private transfers from family or friends, anything like that. And then if we also think about resources, then we have non-cash transfers, so that's food stamps, school lunch program, energy assistance, and housing assistance are basically what comprise that group. And then we have the things that under the supplemental poverty measure we're going to net out. And so what are these things? Well, these things are taxes, and we can think about taxes as federal tax liability before credit, before any tax credits are applied, and by tax credits I mean the child tax credit or the earned income tax credit. We have those actual tax credits. Those are going to count as a plus in terms of resources if they're there. We have payroll taxes, so FICA taxes for Medicare and Social Security that are going to be deducted, and then also state taxes. And then there's also other deductible expenses that are going to be subtracted off of the resources, and these are going to be child support paid. So if you pay child support, that doesn't count toward your income for determining whether or not you're poor. Work expenses, and also out-of-pocket medical expenses. So I just thought it'd be interesting to look at this because it gives us some idea of how policy is supporting men in these different sorts of family arrangements, and also what levers are available to support them. So if we look at this group, so this is the average amount, the percent with the source, and the average amount of positive or negative, so positive if it's a plus or negative if it's something we're subtracting off. And we can see that, so for these guys, on average, your total cash income is $7,200. Most of that is earnings, so $5,000 of it is earnings, but there's other sources as well. So if we look at UI, welfare, and Social Security, it's going to be around $700. And then other cash transfers are around $1,500. And non-cash transfers, they're not really targeted at these guys. So we think about cash welfare, and also other cash or non-cash transfers aren't targeted at these guys, so they're not important. It's $613. Well, only 25% of them are getting it. If they do get these things, then they tend to be substantial in size at $2,400. Tax liability, these guys owe taxes. Well, not all of them, but 46% of them have some tax liability. And the average tax liability is $550. We could see how that breaks out. Some of it is federal tax liability before taxes. These guys aren't really getting much in the way of earned income tax credit or child tax credit, so that shows up here as not very much. And even if they do get it, it's only $290. They do pay payroll taxes, $400, and also state taxes. So that's where their liability comes from. And then their deductible expenses, these are important, so child support paid. There's not that many that pay child support, so the average amount is low at $344, but when they do pay, it tends to be a lot, so $6,000. Work expenses, half of them, about the same share that are working, have them, and they're $650. And then out-of-pocket medical expenses turn out to be fairly large at $1,500 a year. Okay, so that's guys that are poor and they're not in a family. We could look at guys that are that are in a family but they don't have children. Their total cash income is much higher. Their earnings are split between their own earnings and the earnings of others in the household, but their own earnings tend to be a smaller share of total earnings than the earnings of other people. They do have some income from UI welfare and supplemental security, and they do have substantial other cash transfers, but they don't have their non-cash transfers, their food stamps, energy assistance, housing, school lunch is not that high, again, because these things are primarily targeted at families with children. They have substantial tax liability, total tax liability of average of $1,639, and 65% of them roughly have this. Some of that's federal tax liability before credits, and then that would be offset by credits, of course. Payroll taxes are big for this group because they have to pay payroll taxes on their earnings, but also the earnings of others in the household. And so that's where their tax liability comes from. They have substantial deductible expenses. So child support paid, as you expect, is not huge, and there's only 2.8% of them paying it. If they do pay it, it's a lot, though. There are work expenses and substantial out-of-pocket medical expenses, so that's a big part of this. And then lastly, we can look at poor men and families with children. So they're going to be quite a bit different than the other two groups. So they have higher earnings, a higher total cash income. They also contribute a higher share of earnings to the family relative to the previous group. UI, welfare, and supplemental security income is not that high. Other cash transfers is not as high as the second group. But here's a big one. They get a lot more in terms of non-cash transfers, so a lot more food stamps, a lot more housing assistance, a lot more school lunch, a lot more energy assistance. Tax liability, so this is a group that only 28.1% of them actually owe taxes when everything is netted out. So modally, they get benefits from the tax system. And those benefits on average are $1,075. And so how does this work out? Well, their federal income tax liability before credits is $321, but then the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit are really important for guys in these sorts of families, and amounts to over $3,000 per year. They still are responsible for paying payroll taxes and state taxes, though, and so that reduces the amount of that credit that's left over. They have substantial deductible expenses, so this is like $7,300. And a lot of that's work expenses. They have kids, so part of the work expenses are what you need to pay for childcare, but also substantial out-of-pocket medical expenses. Okay, I promised my colleague Tim Smeating that I would say a little bit about the Wisconsin Poverty Report. So this was just released this past week, and if you read the Journal Sentinel, there's a write-up on it. So it's the Poverty Report for 2013. And this is something that that IRP, under the guidance of Tim and some others, has been putting together since 2009 or so. So these are the rates over time, and I don't want to get too into poverty measurement, but he uses, or they use three different rates. One is just a market income only, so that ignores any kind of transfers that people get and doesn't take into account of any taxes. Then there's the official measure, and then there's the Wisconsin poverty measure, which is akin to the supplemental poverty measure that I described already. We can see here that using the supplemental measure, we have a poverty rate of roughly 11%, and that increased slightly from 2012 to 2013. So one of the kind of themes of the report, if you get a chance to take a look at it, I'll urge you to do, and maybe we could make that available, is that we have had job growth in Wisconsin, but we haven't completely recovered the jobs that were lost in 2009. And although we had job growth, we haven't had lots of wage growth, and so that's kind of one of the things that's kind of weighing on this increase. So we do know something about the distribution of poverty across the state. And so there's kind of two counties that we could say definitively have higher poverty rates than the state average. And those would be La Crosse, so the dark county here, and also Milwaukee County. Then there's a bunch of counties that we could definitively say have lower poverty rates than the state average. And those would be the Wow counties, so Washington, Waukesha, Onondaga, Fond du Lac, Calumet, and then a bunch of these counties that kind of border, that are on the Wisconsin-Minnesota border south of Minneapolis-St. Paul. We do also know something about poverty in Milwaukee County. So this is the Milwaukee County picture. I was trying to figure out exactly, looking at a map, what these landmarks are, but I think I-94 comes right through here. So if I had to guess where we are right now, we're right at the kind of border of between the Milwaukee City Central and Milwaukee City South Central. I think this is just a little bit west of the river. And then this is, I believe, Capitol Drive. And my guess is this is like 60th Street. Overall male poverty in Wisconsin is low, 9.7%. But male poverty in most parts of Milwaukee County is higher than the state average. But there are also large differences within the county as well. So we have this pocket here with male poverty of 23.7%, and then the south area where it's extremely low. So this is roughly corresponds with the north side of Milwaukee. Okay, so in conclusion, male poverty in Milwaukee is an urban phenomenon. So we know that more than 75% of poor men live in urban or metro areas. We want to talk about the characteristics of men who are at elevated risk for poverty. They reside in central cities. They're younger than 25 years old. They're black or Hispanic. They are high school dropouts or high school graduates with no college. They're not in married couple families, and they're not working full-time, full year. And it's also the case that these same groups make up a large share of poor men. We do find some evidence in the slides I showed that described why men said they didn't work in a calendar year. We do have some evidence of barriers to employment, so high rates of self-reported disability among men 25 to 64 that were not employed, and also if we looked at the black men, there were higher rates of indicating difficulty finding a job. So what income sources are important to poor men depends on their living arrangements. If we look at these non-family individuals, so there's the guys that are resource sharing units of one, they're not likely to receive cash or non-cash transfers or benefits from tax credits. Most pay payroll taxes and have substantial deductible expenses, so work expenses and also out-of-pocket medical expenses. If we look at men and families without children, cash transfers other than UI, welfare, and supplemental security income are important. The majority pay taxes and have substantial deductible expenses, primarily out-of-pocket medical expenses. And then if we look at men and families with children, non-cash transfers, so the food stamps, the housing assistance, the school lunch, and the energy assistance are important. This group benefits the most from tax credits. So modally, on average, they get net benefits from the tax system. They also have substantial deductible expenses that come in the form of work expenses and out-of-pocket medical expenses. So one kind of big takeaway I have from looking at this is that out-of-pocket medical expenses are a huge drain on the resources of poor men. And it's going to be the case that in 2013, most of these guys aren't eligible for Medicaid. But in states that opted for Medicaid expansion, they will be in later years. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see large declines in this SPM measure in states that chose to take the expansion. I have 1 minute for questions, but yeah.
Jeffrey, what would the increase in the minimum wage do to your statistics?
I mean, it's definitely going to decrease poverty. So if we go back,
Like if it went to
we'll just pick
$12.
Well, I mean, we could safely assume like these are going to go up, right? So all these earnings measures are going to go up by, I don't know. Let's just say there's no other, it's all income, right? There's no offsetting employment effects or anything like that. Well, that's I don't know, a 70% increase. So we could expect these to be 70% higher. So put them up at 8,500, and we're maybe $3,000 or $4,000 higher on this. So it would definitely lead to reduction in poverty. It's also going to we're also going to have like much fewer men who are working full-time, full year that are poor. So we looked at the composition of men that are poor, and we saw that some of them are working full-time, full year. Maybe not so much in the young age group, but maybe a quarter or so in the older age groups, and that we could expect that to go down. So there'd be a larger share, smaller group of poor men, small fraction of poor men, but if we looked at poor men, much fewer of them would be working full-time, and a greater share of them would be either the guys that were not working at all or working less than full-time full year.
They'd all get more money, but would it provide, in addition to that, incentive for those who are not working?
I mean, it could definitely induce labor force participation, but then there's, the question of what other effects does it have in the labor market? Does it reduce you know, does it reduce supply, quantity supplied, or quantity demanded, rather. So I don't know. You know, I could do some simulations and tell you, but it's hard to take into account all the behavioral impacts. The easiest thing to do would be to say they're not there.
Okay. I don't know if I can do this without Mike Goucher to lead me through everything that I need to say. So if I just go silent for a moment, somebody call Goucher and get him to ask me a question. So I'm going to talk mostly about the public opinion side, but I want to talk a little bit about things that are part of driving poverty and inequality and so on. And I specifically want to look at young men to begin with. So I'm going to look at the data from the National Longitudinal Survey. This is a study that began in 1997 with a national sample of young people, 13 to 17, and they've been re-interviewed each year through 2011. So that means that when we see them in 2011, at the point that I'm interested in, they're now all young men. They're 27 to 31. They're no longer high school students. And I'm going to focus only on the men, given the topic of our talks today. So that gives us a sample, again, a nationally representative sample of 3,675 men, all in their late 20s or very early 30s at the time that we interview them. So this is an age where most people have finished their formal education and are entering the job market. The tasks of college or technical training are done. And obviously for people like me that took 20 years to finish high school and college and graduate school and all that, may not be true. But for the vast majority of people by age 27, they're beginning to move into careers. And I'm going to look at, among other things, and most importantly, the consequences of being arrested and being incarcerated, and a couple of other things that clearly drive bad outcomes for people as they move into careers. So of the white males in this sample, 39% had been arrested at some point between the time they were first interviewed in 1997 and 2011 when they were last interviewed. And 8% of those white males had been incarcerated at some point. For African American males, 54% had been arrested and 18% incarcerated. And Hispanic males, 46 arrested and 12 incarcerated. These jail stays were generally not terribly long. The median was just 10 months. And 3/4 of them served 29 months, a little over 2 years or less. On the other hand, remember they're 27 to 31, so a couple of years in jail or prison is not a trivial amount out of the years we're looking at. What are the consequences, though? That's the real focus here. What are the effects on your life circumstances when you're now 27 to 31 of having had that experience of arrest or incarceration? How does it affect outcomes, and in particular our interest today? How does it affect your job prospects, your income prospects, and so on? There are other circumstances here at the bottom that could be affected, having biological children, being married. I'm going to focus more on the economics today because that's what our topic is. The top's a little cut off, but these are effects on the odds of being arrested. And one of the reasons to use this data set in particular is that it measured both the family structure and the parental education when these people were first interviewed in 97. So we know what the family background was that is important for also setting the stage. So if we look at the odds on being arrested, African Americans and Hispanics, people of color, If the rate was exactly average, it would be at 1.0. So with African Americans at 1.4, that's saying there's a 40% increase in the chance that you're arrested if you're African American. A little bit lower than that for Hispanic. For the stats geeks, if you can see this little asterisk, that's a statistically significant effect, but I'm not going to belabor those points. Having come from a two-parent family dramatically reduces the chance of arrest, and parents' education doesn't reduce it as dramatically, but does have an additional effect of lowering arrest rates. What about incarceration? Notice now that Black and Hispanic, while they're still elevated now, are not statistically significant, taking account of these other things. Having two parents reduces the chance that you end up being incarcerated. Parents' ed doesn't matter, but your arrests, especially multiple arrests, dramatically increases. Now, duh, you might say. You go out and you do a bunch of crimes. The biggest rap sheet in this data set was 64 arrests. But the median was 0, right? And then there's a fair number with 1, and then quite a drop to 2, and another drop to 3, and then it's just a very small number. So when you're looking at arrests here, what you're really looking at is a first arrest, which has some impact, but the second arrest and the third arrest especially. Okay. Now the good news, if you want to find good news out of this, is what drives incarceration. Being a repeat offender really helps. Some basic notion of justice, that's a good thing, right? That people go to jail if they're out committing a bunch of crimes. And it's also perhaps good news that even though Black and Hispanic have elevated rates, they're not statistically significant. So maybe race, which did play a big role in having an encounter, an arrest, doesn't seem to play much of an additional role in incarceration, at least in these data. But interestingly, coming from a two-parent household does dramatically lower that chance of being incarcerated, even controlling for the number of arrests, the number of incidents that you were part of. So those are the things that set the stage, and I'm not mentioning, there are a bunch of other control variables like region and urban, rural, and so on that are in this model, but I'm not presenting that just to get to the main point. So these are the things that create one, not the only, but one of the real risk factors for poverty for young males, having a criminal record of some kind. What are the effects on income of these groups? And here it's pretty striking. African Americans and Hispanics, so this is 2011 income, as it is affected by these characteristics or risk factors, if you will. So African American men in their late 20s, early 30s are suffering nearly a $10,000 a year penalty in income in this estimate as a function of race. Hispanics less, but still over $4,000 compared to whites. Okay. Coming from a two-parent household, on the other hand, boosts your income pretty substantially, a little over $3,000 a year. And going to 4 years of additional college, I'm sorry, not of additional college, but 4 years of additional years of schooling dramatically increases income by $10,000. But here's the effect of arrest and having been incarcerated, dramatic reductions in income. Now, surely this is no surprise at all, but it simply quantifies and shows us how big those impacts on earnings are. It also shows us how much of a penalty black males pay for being black, even after we've controlled for their education, their parental status, and their interactions with criminal justice systems. So this is pretty discouraging. This is understandable, but also if you then put those effects together, it's hardly a surprise why we would see dramatically lower incomes and, by inference, higher poverty rates with people who have some combination of these disadvantages that come from both characteristics and from past behavior and experience. And a compensating thing that's good for those of us in the education business, you can do something about that, go to school. persistent and happy finding. What about the second part, the odds of being unemployed? So one is how much money do you make? The other is can you get a job? So the higher this is, the more likely you are to be unemployed. And again, controlling for all of this and some other things, African American men in their 20s, much more likely to be unemployed. Hispanics, elevated but not significant. Now, your parental situation and your family situation don't matter anymore. You're not statistically less likely to be employed if you came from a two-parent household or parents were more educated. But your characteristics matter a huge amount. Again, going to college or going to 4 years of education is not necessarily the same thing, right? You could have technical training in that, so let me be careful. But it dramatically reduces your chance of being unemployed by 40% or so. But arrests, and especially incarcerations, again, drive tremendously up this. Now, none of this is surprising, right? You would expect people who've been in jail to have a hard time getting jobs. You would expect people who didn't get education to have a harder time finding jobs. So the question, which I'm going to leave to the other panelists to solve, is what are the policy solutions to this? So I'm waiting on you guys to do that. And the happy news is there actually are some programs that seem to work, and I know we'll hear a little bit about that later. But this is just to lay out what these challenges are in the world that we live in and just how big these effects are on those prospects. And they're quite substantial. I'm not going to go into others, but if I showed you the chances that you became married by the time you're 27 to 31, you would see a similar effect. People who've been in jail, people who've had a lot of arrests, much less likely to be married by the time they're in their late 20s. So if you think of the combination of challenges of poverty, criminal record stands out, education, or moreover its lack, stands out, and as we saw with Jeffrey's presentation, you know, family structure matters a lot. People who were in two-person households, especially married couple households, get better income, collectively at least. So those are the challenges, I think. Now, what is to be done, as someone once said? And the answer is, I don't know, but let's see what the public in Wisconsin thinks. So now I'm switching to the Marquette Law School poll data about attitudes here. The most direct issue that we've seen in the last 4 years on public benefits is the proposal to drug test people for unemployment and food stamps and other public benefits. This turns out to be a political winner. 56% say we should test people for drugs before they get benefits. 41% say not test. What I want to walk you through with this and each issue as we go is the same set of other characteristics that structure these opinions, okay? So what about an urban-suburban-rural gap? There's a bit of one. Urban people, let's look at, just focus on the greens that are saying we should test for benefits. Urbanites are a little less likely to say we should do that. It goes up with suburban and up a shade more with rural. These are not huge differences, but they're persistent differences. So there's a little bit of a urban versus the rest of the state difference in structure here. What about income? And just so you know, these are roughly thirds of the income distribution, family income, not individual income in the state. So the lowest income groups, if you look at the gap between these two, are in favor of testing, but by a smaller amount. It grows a bit here and it grows slightly more here. So the folks that are a little bit closer to low income and therefore at more risk of needing benefits at some point are a little bit less supportive, but still on balance think this testing's a good idea. What about by education? There's very little difference except for these guys out here. Even the lowest education level, and this is a substantial number of people, this is relatively fewer people, But in both of those groups, they think drug testing is not a bad idea. And then it bounces around a bit as we go through the middle levels of education. The post-BA people are folks with master's or higher or some kind of post-baccalaureate education. And you can see that they're the only education group in the state that prefers not to do drug testing. You'll watch these guys on the one end and these guys on the other as we look at a few other points. There's some nice differences. How about age? Well, the young hippies want their drugs, man. Now, if there was ever a comment made by a refugee from the 1960s and 70s, you just heard it, right? When did you last hear about hippies? God, I'm old. But the young people are the one distinction here. Everybody that's over 30 wants to test. You'll see that come up again. There are racial differences. In fact, here, African Americans stand out as very different. Interestingly, Hispanics and whites are not that different from one another on this issue. But again, you'll see that vary a little bit as we go across some other issues. And then the big one is not about people's economic or educational or racial or geographic locations. It's about their psychological orientation to party. And the big gap in what we always call polarized Wisconsin between Republican views about issues and Democratic and independent views about those issues. And so if we found a few moderately interesting differences across the groups demographically, based on who they were, what their characteristics were, what they had learned or invested or through income and education and so on, those are fairly modest differences in structuring attitudes towards drug testing for benefits. Partisanship stands out as a much stronger effect. Well, you'll be shocked to know we'll see that result again on the next slides as well. Okay? But there's a punchline at the end, so don't let me forget to make the punchline at the end. What's the attribution for why people can't get jobs? On the one hand, it's because there are just not jobs out there. People are looking, they can't find them. The other attribution is it's because the job seekers lack the skills for those jobs. There's a little bit of a two-part story here, and I can't completely disentangle it. On the one hand, you could say the lack of skills reflects, the dramatic increase in the skills needed to program a machine tool, for example, compared to the good old days where it was a skilled craftsman that knew how to adjust the screws to just the right setting to make that machine part. So there's greater education required. That's one part of the so-called skills gap, it's cited in every single talk about this topic, so I will too. Welders! Where do you find a welder who can make that piece of that weld just perfectly to accomplish what it wants? So that might be a part of the skills gap. The other part of the skills gap, though, is the folks that simply didn't go to enough education to equip themselves for the job. So I want to be clear that the lack of skills is a little bit of mix of these two things. One part doesn't have anything to do with the individuals per se, but rather the changing type of economy and requirements for jobs. The other, though, is the sort of human capital of what we've invested in ourselves or what the state, the society has invested in training people. And so that lack of skills is certainly a part of this as well. But you see from the result here that a majority say that people can't get jobs because they haven't, for one reason or another, they're not prepared for the jobs that are out there rather than that there's simply no jobs to be found. Okay? How does this differ? And I'm going to go through these same demographics that we saw a minute ago. Urban areas are much more likely to say it's the jobs aren't there. As we move into the suburbs and the rural areas, people are more likely to say it's skills. People just aren't ready for the jobs that exist. By income, there's a modest progression, but mostly the difference is over here on the $75,000 and up, the top third of income, which are more likely to say it's the job applicants that don't have the skills rather than the lack of jobs. By education, here I told you to keep an eye out on the extremes. The people without a high school diploma are much more likely to say, there are just no jobs, right? Not its lack of skills. But interestingly, as soon as you move just an increment more to high school, people are more likely to say, don't have the skills. Maybe that arises out of personal experience. You know, a high school diploma used to be a pretty valuable entry point into the job market. Now it's not to the extent it was. I was making an argument to someone the other day that, you know, for a lot of logistics jobs, shipping and receiving, you know, think of the Amazon operation down near the border, that there ought to be a lot of jobs there for people with sort of high school diplomas because, you know, you're doing manual stuff that so far at least the robots can't do very well. And they corrected me and said, actually, a lot of the people hiring in that want a 2-year technical college degree because you have to interact with programmable machinery, with computers that are giving you orders and stuff like that. And that sort of surprised me. But maybe that reflects the same surprise to a high school graduate who thought that they'd done pretty well by graduating from high school and then goes to apply to Amazon and they say, well, which technical college did you go to? I don't know that they say that. That was my interpretation. But anyway, there's a little bit of a reversal there at the bottom end of education, and then up at the high end, the post-BA people, a little more balance between seeing it as a skills gap versus a jobs gap. But otherwise, everybody in the middle basically says lack of skills is a huge barrier. How about by age? There's not much here. The young are a little more likely to say it's lack of jobs, but basically most folks are on the same page there. Here by race, there's a big difference. African Americans much more likely to see a lack of jobs as an issue. Both Hispanics and whites more likely to see it as a skills gap. And there's party again, with just really big differences. And most politically important is who do these guys end up aligning with? Because no one of these three groups is a majority. Put any two of them together and you have a majority. So where do these alignments fall? And at least on this issue, independents and Republicans have more in common than Democrats have with independents. That's not always the case, though. All right, let's move on to another piece, and this is on equal opportunity. We're talking a lot about inequality in America, both in terms of the income distribution and in terms of social mobility. These next three questions I'm looking at are in collaboration with Amber Wachowski in the Political Science Department here. Is Amber here? I don't see you. Oh, there you are. Okay, back row, back bencher. So credit where credit's due. These are Amber's questions done on our survey and collaboratively in the sense that we talk about the items and so on. But it also led to an NSF grant, right, to follow up on these results. So bravo, good work. So the first of these questions is, should society do everything it can to ensure equal opportunity for all? And you can see this is nearly completely consensual. 86% agree that the society should have and should provide equal opportunities for everyone. Just 13% disagree. It's consensual across region. Everybody agrees across regions. It's consensual across income. It's consensual across education. Consensual across age. Even the young people got the message. That's a little joke about the young. Very consensual among African Americans. Not one single person said no. But consensual in the other groups too. And lo and behold, there can be bipartisan agreement on something. Every party, every partisan agrees on the importance of this as a fundamental value, that equal opportunity for all should be the norm in the society. So then the next question is, how big are differences in income? Are differences in income in America today too large? Agree or disagree? So now it's not 86 or 7% anymore, it's 70% agree, but there's a substantial sense that income disparities are large. What about the breakdown of those? That perception is essentially the same regardless of where you live. Surprisingly, perhaps, it's largely the same regardless of your income. Maybe there's a little uptick in denying that in the top third of income, but it's a modest difference at least. By education, roughly the same, and there's certainly broad agreement. None of these, though, are bumping up against the 100% mark, right? We saw the others. In fact, I was afraid my little label here was going to cover some of the bars because I'm not used to any bars getting up quite that high. These don't run into the label up here. They're comfortably below it, but still strong majorities across the board. Here it is by age, and the young are a little bit more concerned about the inequality, and everybody over 30, again, really there's not much of an age gradient with those groups. Here, not much disparity or at least disagreement between whites and blacks and Hispanics, actually slightly more likely to say income disparities are too high. But there's more of a difference on party, but it's still a majority of each partisan group, or a plurality, yeah, it is a majority of each group, say that disparities are too high. So this is an interesting moment in our history of the opportunity for policy change on this area where lots of people say income inequality is too high. That would be an obvious opportunity to do something about low-income folks and so on, except for this. Should government do anything about it? So 38% say government should act to reduce income differences, and a pretty substantial 57% disagree with that. Government should not act. And this gap between an almost universal commitment to equality of opportunity, a growing concern, obviously this is just one point in time, but other surveys show concern for income inequality has been growing over the last couple of decades. So considerable, 70% concerned about that, think the differences are too great. But then the one actor that could most step in and change that, substantial opposition to. Okay? Again, there's some open questions here. Is it because you don't believe government's competent to do it? Or it's because redistribution of wealth is not the preferred outcome? I can't answer that question. I can't distinguish why people say government shouldn't intervene. It is certainly the case that the belief in the efficacy of government is at an all-time low. It's been plummeting since the 1960s. When we ask people, does government usually accomplish what it sets out to do, an enormous majority says nope. Okay? So that could be one perfectly good reason. There's also certainly an ideological sense, a value sense in the country that redistribution per se is not a good thing. Maybe fixing equality, certainly fixing equality of opportunity has lots of support, but actually taking from the rich and giving to the poor, not so much. Should. Should the government take action to reduce income inequality? Thank you. Okay, so let's see who thinks that. Again, urban areas stand out as a little less likely to oppose government action, or a little more likely to favor it, though on balance still oppose. We've seen urban areas stand out a little bit more on most of these measures, though not extremely so, but to some extent, with the suburban and rural areas pretty solidly opposed. Income, though, does work the way you might think it would, right? Who would benefit from any kind of action to reduce inequality, and who would it cost? Well, this one at least lines up with what economists, sorry, that was a small joke to dig, the political scientist digging at the economist. Anyway, what the economists would expect from self-interest, which in political science so rarely shows up as obvious self-interest, nevertheless seems to show up pretty nicely here. Well, you might think it should, if it ever did. So, quite a difference there. Education, not so much, except the lowest levels of education would be more willing to see government action. Notice that those folks out here with high education who were concerned with inequality are now not that concerned with redistributing wealth for some odd reason. And those youngsters still remain the different group, but by the time they seem to reach their 30s, they get over it. Okay? Remember earlier I said that Hispanic and white opinion matched, but on this issue they don't. Hispanic and African American opinion matches a bit more in favor of some government action on wealth disparities. And you won't be surprised to see large partisan differences appear, and here they are. So that's the broad structure of these things. If we go through and try to kind of pull together all those results, there are modest but occasional differences in geography between the urban areas and the rest of the state. They're not enormous, but they do show up fairly often. Income actually didn't have much of an effect in anything except that last issue, which most directly would affect people based on their income, but not so much on the other things. So that's a worthwhile note. Education pops up occasionally as mattering a bit, but it tends to be at the extremes. So the best educated tend to be a little bit different. Sometimes the least educated are, but there's not a consistent, strong effect of education on any of these. Ethnicity, African American and Hispanic, we usually see some differences, but which direction they go, sometimes Hispanics look more like whites, sometimes Hispanics and African Americans look more like each other. It's not a real consistent pattern there, but certainly more of a concern about inequality, more concern about how to address that. And then the one thing that in my little notes here, I have a check under each column for partisanship. So party identification remains the one thing that structured every one of these attitudes where we see large differences. So I wanted to close with what the implications of that are. If party dominates, rather than your self-interest as represented by your age, your education, your income, with the caveat that income matters at least in one of these, then we're talking about something that goes more to what people believe rather than who they are. These opinions are not as structured by individuals' personal circumstances as they are structured by their beliefs and their preferences. So where does that leave us? The usual answer is, well, we're so polarized, nothing's ever going to happen because we split on this. And yeah, there's a lot of that. But I at least wanted to point out a couple of possibilities of areas where there are two different ways to see political action as possible out of this, that in ways that might benefit both parties. That's the key point. Do we see anything that both parties could benefit from? So one of those is actually some things that are beginning to bubble up about incarceration of nonviolent offenders. Grover Norquist, the famous anti-tax guy, was here in the state recently talking about government waste in the form of super expensive prisons locking up kids for having a bit of marijuana. And that from a conservative point of view, it makes no sense to spend such vast resources of the society on such a trivial crime. That's something that's bubbled up in prison reform discussions in South Carolina with a Republican governor, Republican legislature. It has not moved to the forefront here. There's little discussion, but it could at some point. But that's a potential possibility of how do we treat nonviolent offenders, how do we bear the costs of dealing with them, however we deal with them, and whether resources devoted more heavily to dealing with violent offenders might be something that could gain some bipartisan effects. Another is expungement, the idea that if someone has been incarcerated but then has been out successfully without reoffending for some amount of time, and of course you could vary how much that time is it 5 years, is it 10 years, whatever, but at some point, think back to the earlier slides, the impact of having been incarcerated was very substantial. Some of that is because of what happens to you in prison, and I mean in many ways, that you're not in education, you're not getting a job, so even if nobody knew you were incarcerated, those would still be deficits. But there's no question that having a record that people find as soon as they look you up is surely a gigantic impediment to employment and to income. So expungement after some period of good behavior, successful reintegration, may be one thing that, again, it's possible both parties could ultimately agree on. One where we used to have a lot of agreement was the Earned Income Tax Credit, a mechanism that provided direct income transfers to people who were working but of low income. There's been some breakdown in the bipartisanship on that issue, but it's one that, at least in principle, has certainly had a lot of both Democratic and Republican supporters in the past. So those are some things that I can see where bipartisan incentives might exist. Then there's a different way of thinking about this, and this is where the parties dramatically disagree with each other, but might both be offering different but nevertheless plausible options for policy change. And here I'm thinking, for example, of urban enterprise zones. The idea from a Republican side, this goes back to Jack Kemp in the 1990s, the idea of providing tax breaks and other kinds of incentives to businesses to move into high poverty areas and do it that way. Now, I have no idea what works in general, so I'm making no claims that this would or would not be effective, but I'm simply pointing to it as an example of a potential new set of policy initiatives coming from the conservative and Republican side of the aisle that would nevertheless be action to try to address this. More on the Democratic side would be things like job training, or with a longer-term perspective, more pre-K and K-12 child care and so on, because we know that a lot of problems that children in difficult circumstances encounter can be at least somewhat ameliorated, those kinds of early programs. So those are two very different ways of approaching it, but it seems to me that without bipartisanship, you could nevertheless have each party, if you will, competing for good ideas of how to address these issues. If you take these last slides on party ID as being pretty compelling, it's going to be very hard to get a bipartisan consensus on most issues. Maybe how we treat incarceration is one of those. But I think there's perhaps a positive version that if both parties were incentivized, if I can say that, to adopt policies of their own that are true to their own philosophical roots to try to address these things. Some will work, most probably won't, but we would be seeing more action there and maybe a little less gridlock and nothing happening. So I'm going to quit and open it up for questions. Bob.
Charles, let me take you back to your first set of slides based on the NLS.
Yeah.
In that set of slides, you were trying to explain the determinants of income and education.
Right.
And at the right-hand side of those slides, you had arrests and incarceration
Right.
as playing big roles.
Right.
And you described arrests and incarcerations as individual behavior. And I'd like to suggest a caveat, because when you put the onus here on the behavior of the individual, you're assuming that police, the prosecutors, the judges play no role in this. And I would say that those big impacts are in part due to the criminal justice system and its structure, as well as individual behavior.
Yes, excellent point. Obviously, if you have policing policies that target certain groups or certain economic groups, not just racial groups, then I think you're making an excellent point. The other would be the types of crimes that are targeted, right? So the war on drugs, as it is played out for low-level kinds of drugs, certainly has a disproportionate impact there. And we all know about the difference in sentencing between cocaine and crack, for example, as another example of that. So I think that's an important correction, and you're exactly right. There's more that goes into those effects on the right than just the individual's choices.
I'm wondering about the extent to which you might get different assessment of whether or not people favor government efforts to reduce income disparities, depending on how you frame the question. For example, like I'm always, and I think this has been something that's come out in the Marquette poll, is that there's support for increasing the minimum wage, for instance. So if you ask people about that, they'll say, yes, I'm for it. But if you ask them very generally about should government do something about this, they'll say no.
Yeah. Did people in the back hear that? Do you need me to repeat it? I see mixed. The question is, there are other ways to ask about government action to address income inequality. Different wording of the question would produce different results. We also have results that Jeffrey mentions exactly right. We show a substantial percentage favoring an increase in the minimum wage, which, would have whatever debatable effects you were saying earlier that might have, but certainly that's a difference. So by no means is this one question about should government act the only way to address it. It's simply one of many ways. And it would be of interest, though we don't have a big battery, a collection of these things that could go down a wide variety of policy proposals. Partly that reflects my own lack of insight, and partly it reflects that there's not that many proposals floating around and actively on the legislative agenda at the moment. Yes?
My question is this. Do you have any documentation on the impact that recidivism have on incarceration?
I do not. There may be people here that know more about that than I do. And so I guess I'm going to stop there and say I don't really know. This group of young men I'm looking at do have some repeat offenses, and a small handful of them have more than one episode of incarceration. But I haven't looked at it to try to tease that out. And simply because they're fairly young, if we were looking at 40-year-olds, we'd see more cycles of incarceration and recidivism, or the lack of it. The one thing that is beautiful, and I do know something about, and it's right here in Wisconsin as well as nationally, is how sharp the decline in criminal arrests is with age. So arrest rates peak in the 20s. They fall off pretty sharply. And so, this is an argument that, even when you're looking at repeat offenders or people who have been incarcerated and come back out, there's still a pretty sharp age gradient. So people do seem to, at the very least, get arrested less often with age, and that's a pretty sharp effect. But what the causal effect is it experience, is it bad experiences? I'm afraid I can't address that. So, in the back. Alas, no, not in our data. I'm sorry, Amber.
So some of the additional research that we've been looking at, so there's a comment about, well, change the question wording, and maybe it's about particular programs that the public supports. There's lots of evidence for that. People identify as conservative, but then you ask them about spending on particular programs, they say yes, yes, sure. The second piece is that we also see increased support for these programs if people are thinking about a person and not a program. So we have a study that describes the typical recipient of various programs, and we see that that sort of sociological imagination about who's benefiting from these programs increases support. The direct spending, direct action.
Great.
Can you dare repeat the question?
Oh, yeah. Well, Amber's the person that's done this research, and so that's, you just heard it from the original source here, or you didn't hear it, as the case may be. But excuse me, Amber, jump in if I'm not paraphrasing well enough. But my takeaway was, when you ask about programs in general, responses are not as positive. But when you talk about individuals and their characteristics who might be recipients of these things, people are considerably more supportive of them. And so, again, how it goes in part to what issues we ask about, it also goes to who people are thinking about. And the last bit was, we don't interact with people that different from us economically that often, that we're living in fairly income segregated communities. And so it's an act of imagination to imagine the different person rather than one of direct experience. Amber, go ahead.
Yeah, and then just the final piece was about how these programs get delivered, and increased support if these programs are delivered through the tax code, so like the EITC versus direct spending.
Right. And that's a great point, because the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, is a well-established mechanism that we know how to do. If it's also fairly popular as a mechanism, somewhat more directly possible. Yes?
I would just like to answer the lady.
Oh, great.
Because I am involved with some jail literacy. The national recidivism rate is 75%, but with education, it's more like 45%. So education makes a big difference.
Education in the prison system, or after, or both?
Well, it could be both.
Yeah, but you're talking specifically within prison.
Right.
So a good argument for that. How are we doing on time?
In your polling, are you able to differentiate in the urban, suburban, rural categories geographically? Because the Milwaukee, Racine, Kenosha, Beloit, Janesville urban area has a very different makeup than Superior, Eau Claire, Fox Valley.
No, you're certainly right. We can differentiate down to the county level, so we could regroup them any way we wanted to. The urban-suburban rural is sort of the conventional way of doing it, but I agree with you, it's certainly not the only way we could think about it. And for a more finely tuned geographic analysis of the state, something like that would be good. In the back?
I'd like to go back to the prison reform. The nonviolent offenders. Okay, my question is the answer expungement, or is it diversion programs?
Yes.
In the first place, I mean, we need prison prevention in some of these programs.
Yeah.
Maybe in some of the rural areas, we can go into the schools and start when the children are, do some more of these. Back in the 1970s and 60s, the police used to come out and tutor and mentor kids. Okay, nowadays it's all about enforcement.
Yeah.
Okay, and it's even with the kids. Some of the kids, it's just a lot of havoc going on and chaos in the community. In the urban community. The rural is kind of flooding out into the outlying areas, but it's concentrated in that urban, rural area.
I did not mean to say expungement was the only solution to the nonviolent offender. I probably didn't say it right, but the diversion, yeah.
5-7 years,
Yeah.
that's a good idea.
Yeah.
But the thing of prison prevention with the nonviolent offenders, diversion program.
Yes. I think we're actually in complete agreement on this. Yeah. So the beauty here is there are ideas percolating up across the ideological and partisan spectrum on these things, which, is sort of a rare case. In my business, mostly I only talk about polarization. So it's an area where there are some interesting developments. I wouldn't by any means say that we've gotten to the nirvana of a consensual solution to them, but at least this is an area where I think there is some real dialogue and some real thought about it. Okay, one more then? Hang on, the mic's coming to you.
When you look at people's opinions on people needing skills, the lack of skills, are you able to distinguish between technical and educational skills and sort of the so-called soft skills? Because I'm sure that, especially on ideological things, there'd be a big disagreement.
Yeah. We have not tried to go into that yet, but stay tuned. We're thinking about some things. I don't mean to hint too much on this, just we are going to be looking over the next few months at things like human capital, especially in the region, and some of that will come out then, but we have not looked at it in any of the current work. Okay? Terry?
Charles?
Thank you.
Okay, let us begin again. We do not want to lose our hard-earned reputation for running the trains on time. As my first-year property professor would tell us, fewer people would miss them if the trains ran on time. So I mentioned this morning that only through partnerships and collaboration do any of us have a hope of meaningfully addressing hard problems such as urban men and poverty, and that our president at Marquette University, Dr. Michael Lovell, is a great champion of partnerships. In fact, he was here at the law school on a number of occasions, even while he was at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, first as Dean of Engineering and then as Chancellor. I'm really grateful for the support and the leadership that he gives us at Marquette Law School as we explore difficult public policy topics, and that he wishes to say a few words this morning. So please welcome Marquette University's President, Dr. Michael Lovell.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, and it's great to see so many people here today. And as Dean Kearney often says, you know, the Marquette Law School is a place at which the community gathers to discuss important issues facing the city, the state, and the nation, and oftentimes discussing some really serious and hard problems. And today really is an excellent example. And we couldn't be more thrilled the fact that today is the first ever collaboration between the UW-Madison Lafayette School of Public Affairs and the Marquette Law School. And when we think about, you know, the issues of urban men and poverty in cities, I think Milwaukee in particular is a great test bed for us, because certainly it may be the most stark problem facing our city, and certainly one of the greatest facing any city in the country. And when we have problems that run so deep and are so difficult, we all know that it's very difficult to solve them on an island or by yourself. And so I believe the only way we're going to face and overcome the challenges that we have in terms of urban men and poverty is by working together. And today represents hopefully a first of many meetings and discussions that we will have to address these issues. Because the reality is that there's no silver bullet that's going to solve what we're facing today. These problems run very deep. They build up over a period of 30, 40, if not 50 years. And so you can't unwind them in a year or two. These are long-term solutions that they're akin to running a marathon. And I know that we won't find the solutions unless we talk about them and work together. And so I can't be more excited about the fact that we have so many people in the room today with such a strong interest in finding ways to make a positive difference and positive impact and getting us moving in the right direction. And we're only going to do that, and we'll do it faster, and we'll do it better by working together. So, again, I want to congratulate you all for being here. I'm going to congratulate the collaboration that's going on, and I just look forward to the positive progress that you all make today. So thank you.
Several people for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. I want to thank Drs. Haveman and Wallace for taking me to a wonderful burger lunch and convincing me to do this today. So all you need to do is give me a burger and I'm good. And at a place I've never been in Madison. And also I want to thank Dean Kearney and Dr. Janke as well for being here and hosting me, allowing me to do this work, and seeing some friends of mine I haven't seen in a while, like Dr. Wolf, who were instrumental in the work that I initially did as a young scholar, trying to be scholar when I was a doctoral student, and learning about issues of child support, low-income men, and poverty, and how all those intersected. And also I want to recognize a colleague who's here, Greg Williams, who allowed me to do my most recent research, who was with the Milwaukee Area Workforce Investment Board, which is what I'll talk about a lot at the latter part of my presentation. I want to start out with the story of one of the men who I interviewed when I first started doing this work. I'm a qualitative researcher, so I live in storytelling and phenomenology and collecting lots of data and looking at a lot of things to decide why is the world work the way it works. And I'm going to talk about Peter, who was a 23-year-old father of 4 biological children, and he also was taking care of a non-biological child, which I found to be very common amongst the men that I would interview at the time I was doing my interviews in 1999. And many of those men still haven't changed in now 2015. It was, even though it was very unique to me to see a man who had 4 kids he was very engaged with, and also this non-biological child he was engaged with. He knew all of their birthdays, he knew where they lived, he knew what their grades were, he knew a lot about them, much contrary to what I was being taught in class, as well as to what I thought as someone who was trying to understand this particular phenomenon of child support and non-residential fathers. And also he was residential. He wasn't non-residential and very involved. He was trying to gain custody of his 4-year-old son because the child's mother was involved in illegal activities. His own mother was housing his son and his son's brother, and was also the legal foster parent for her grandchild. She had helped Peter get his current job, so he was working with his mother at his current job, and was also assisting with transportation back and forth to work. And one thing that I would do is ask for the men to always give me any information that would help me understand how child support affected their lives. So I would also ask for their checks, I would ask for their child support statements, and so he had just shared with me a check that he had got, and his entire check had been garnished. It was 0. And he had told me that, and I said to myself, I don't believe that. So as a researcher, I need to see that, because if I say that to someone, my chair of my department, the chair of my committee, who was Dan Meyer, he would say, we need evidence of that. And so I got the evidence, and the check did say 0. He had made that particular 2 weeks, he had made over that 2-week period $700, and all of it had been garnished to child support. And I found that to be quite interesting. Like, you can lose your whole check when we're encouraging employment, we're encouraging involvement, but there's this one kind of policy that's taking all of their money, and then that money wasn't necessarily going to his child, but going to the state to reimburse them for the TANF or AFDC benefits that mother had received. Despite his first experience with receiving a non-negotiable check, he continued to work. He kept going to work because he felt that was his job as a father, as a person who was trying to be an example to his kids. And he was working and maintaining an apartment at the same time, even though he didn't have a full check. And so because he had to have an apartment to bring his kid to some space, so the child welfare system was also involved in his life, not just the child support system, but also the child welfare system, because he was trying to get custody. So I came and saw him another 4 weeks later, and I said, well, did you get another check? Did you work it out? And he got another check, which was, again, 0. So this man has worked 4 weeks, has gotten 2 checks, which have all gone to child support, and it was 0. And it was that experience from learning about this whole idea of how child support worked in terms of the enforcement tactics it had, and also the issue of a variety of other enforcement tactics that led me to wanting to know more about who are these men, what are some of the issues they're challenged with, and how do we get them to be, as I'm always told, to be more involved with their children. I want to thank the people. I make sure I have to give some kind of thanks to people who have helped me with this work I'm going to talk about today over the last 2 years. I have a co-investigator who is Dr. Tupetsis, who is expert in trauma as well as a child welfare expert, and that's why. And so for one of the first times for me, I'm being a good researcher and working with someone to do my work and not doing it alone. And I also have the advantage of having a wonderful doctoral student. But also I hired 10 undergrad students to be part of my research team. At UW-Milwaukee, we have this really wonderful opportunity where we can hire undergrads, and they get a wonderful stipend of about $2,000 if the academic wants to apply for that. And I train them on how to do qualitative work and how to interview these men, how to collect survey data. So I want to thank them for this work that I think is really groundbreaking, but also it gives me a good insight into who these men are that are very much marginalized, but also very poor. I also want to make sure I acknowledge all the money I've gotten and all the support. I want to first thank the Institute for Research on Poverty for giving me an opportunity to be a research scholar. to understand child support. It's where I got a lot of good training and got a lot of good understanding of how to be an academic. So everyone else gets a shout out, but mainly Institute for Research on Poverty, because they really have been so supportive of who I am. I want to start out with an incident that's really important to my work right now, and that's Walter Scott. And if you haven't heard about Walter Scott, he's the man who was murdered, or allegedly murdered, however you want to look at it, in South Carolina. And the reason he was running away from his car was because he was fearful of being incarcerated for child support. Over the last 2 weeks, I've been interviewed by MSNBC, the New York Times, NPR, because I'm someone who knows about this phenomena of people who are incarcerated for non-payment of child support. And so for someone like Walter Scott, he's someone before I became an academic, I was a social worker who did direct service. I delivered work or delivered services to men who had children who were very poor, who very much were a Walter Scott. I ran a fatherhood program for 3 or 4 years who would be a Walter Scott who would come to my program. And we would try to figure out how do we get you to be more involved with your children, but also how do we get you to pay your child support, how do we get you to be self-sufficient, how do we get you to have housing, et cetera, et cetera. But one thing about Walter Scott I have to say, unfortunately he was murdered, but unfortunately also this topic of what does it mean to be under the eyes or surveillance of child support, what does that really mean and how does it really work for very low-income men or men who are having some struggles in their employment possibilities. The group of people that I primarily talk about are non-custodial fathers with children on TANF and child support orders. So my group of people are generally right in here. I generally want to look at the intersections of a policy where the mother is engaged in, which requires her to cooperate and assign her rights to child support to the state, but also requires some other things that may make their lives a little more complex and complicated. And if you look at this child support to make sure that we all are on the same page, you can have a child support order under a variety of situations. I'm lucky to be married to an attorney who helps me understand the legal context of child support because I had no idea as a social worker what that meant. But there's a variety of ways you can get into the child support system. It could be if you're divorced or separated. It could be that you've established paternity, just to acknowledge that you have a child. It could be then you have an order that follows that. It can be that your partner goes into the TANF system and they're required to name a father of their child. Otherwise, it could compromise whether they receive TANF benefits. And also when the non-custodial parent is unemployed or very low income, there's also that unique situation of how does that work with these particular men in this situation. I'm really very appreciative of Dr. Wallace and Dr. Franklin for that beginning part of this talk because it really helped me to put in some context or put you in some context of how the men I'm talking about are very low income, have some particular struggles with their life and make a big difference. This is going to make how this particular policy can make a difference in their life. I'm going to kind of go through these slides, these next couple of slides a little quick because they're not the main part of my topic, but it's kind of giving you an idea of why I do the work that I do. I was part of the child support demonstration evaluation that was done in 1997 and went on for quite a number of years, where we looked at how do men who owe child support, what do they look like, what are some of the issues they confront, but also this issue of a pass-through. Wisconsin was the only state in the country where when a mother who was a recipient of a TANF check or former AFDC check, her money was now going to be 100% passed through to her. It wasn't going to be retained by the state. Previous to that, it was $50, but we wanted to see how does that work. But more importantly, I wanted to see whether men understood whether the mother was getting that money and what does that mean for the relationship they would have with the mother and the child. What we found was that the average number of men, at least in the work I was doing, had 2 children. However, their UI wages in 1999 was about $9,000, somewhat close to what we heard from Jeffrey. And then because I looked at those men over a 2-year period, their wages were about $8,000 the next year. The categories of men in the study that I talked to or were working with were men without a job. So a lot of the men I worked with or talked to over those 2-year period, and it was a number of 36 men total. And I did all of my work in Milwaukee. I would identify a man randomly because of, again, the training I received from Dr. Myers. We wanted to make sure that I had a different kind of qualitative sample. So my sample was totally random. So I would randomly choose out of my 1,000 men, and then we narrowed that down to 250 men, and then we narrowed it down to 40 men. I learned how to be a quantitative researcher in a very quick moment, how to do it randomly. I would go and send out a letter, and then if I didn't get a response, I would just go to their house and ring the doorbell and say, hey, will you do research with me? I got quite a lot of interesting responses, believe me. But I think that my training as a social worker and how do you try to form a relationship really quickly helped a lot. So I'm glad I was able to kind of figure how do you do a home visit that makes sense. So the men I narrowed it down to 40 men, were men that fit the three categories of without a job, without a stable job, or they had what we call a sustainable job, but it was very few of them that had what we would call a sustainable job. We were in some of the poorest areas of where Milwaukee was at the time. Race was, I only did African American men. Education levels have already been told by Jeffrey that they were very low, and also we heard the same thing from Dr. Franklin. Unemployment was high, poverty was high as well. The one thing that made me get even more interested was in my research and investigation, I found out that people were going to jail for not paying the child support. And it's a nonviolent offense that you don't have any money. It's a nonviolent offense that you can't pay your child support. But for this particular phenomena, you could be incarcerated for non-payment. You could be, a warrant goes out for your arrest after 120 days of non-payment of child support. And if you're stopped for whatever reason, and a warrant and it shows you need to go to jail, you just go to jail, and the people sit in jail not knowing why they're there, but there was just a warrant for their arrest. And I found through my data collecting that I did in the time period of my particular research period that 6,000 men had been booked over that time period for non-payment of child support. I was able to get that from the Sheriff's Department in Milwaukee. It took a lot of investigation. I felt like I was doing a Watergate investigation at some point, because you can't find this information out. And now this is criminal child support that was talked about. I'm talking about here. It's a criminal issue as to how I was able to get this data. The civil contempt issues are much, much higher. And that's what I was told by child support and still continue to get told by child support. There's a lot more civil contempt issues that go out, or civil contempt warrants that go out versus criminal. And civil contempt is basically you have willfully, or you're seen as willfully not cooperating or making a payment to child support. So again, when I saw this number, it made me think about, so who are these men? What's going on in their lives, and why is this number so high? Then also, why are we putting people in jail who obviously don't have a whole lot of money? When I went through my understanding of the child support laws, if you don't have any money and your income is zero, your order should be a zero. So I was just trying to understand, why isn't that being followed? Or am I missing something? What does that really all mean? So I kept wanting to know more and investigate it further. What I found in my first work was that the most common way people were stopped or they went to jail was through traffic violations. In Milwaukee, when I was doing my work, I was required to always use a university car or a new car. So when I would go in these neighborhoods, the police got to know who I was, and I would get often stopped by the police. What are you doing here? What are you up? I would get up and they would search the car. And it was interesting, I had to talk to Dan Meyer again. And one time I was said to Dan, what do I do if I go to jail? And he said, you have to go to jail because it's part of your research. And I said, okay. I said, I got 2 kids at home and a wife, what do I do? And he said, because of the nature of my work, I often would pick up the men, and we may be in interviews for literally 14, 15 hours a day. I mean, I would literally just hang with them and do whatever their day was to understand, what does it mean to be someone who is in this community, who is poor, and is trying to make ends meet? And oftentimes some of those men would be drug dealers, because I didn't know that till I met them. They may have drugs on their person, they may have drugs on their body. And when we would get stopped by the police, it was often an issue for me to have to understand, what do I do? And if I said to the police officer, look, I'm a researcher, that's the drug dealer, not me. That wouldn't have been very good for my presence in the community. And word would get around, don't trust him. Don't work with him. He's going to turn you in. He's not really there for you to support you. So the protocol was that Dan said, if that does happen, you go to jail, call me, and I'll come get you. And that was a real protocol I had to really think about, because I didn't know what to do in terms of trying to be a qualitative researcher who had some integrity, but also was respecting these men and that they were giving me information to further my career and further my life. But it was a very valuable time. So the one thing I found was that in my own sample, between a 2-year period, the amount of incarcerations increased significantly. Only in a 24-month period. So these men are under surveillance on a regular basis. And that surveillance made me think about, even though I had the advantage of coming here and doing research and then going to my nice home in Madison, I was stressed out. But I was allowed to relax when I got home, maybe have a beer, maybe have a drink, whatever it was. I could relax and go into my home and feel safe. But these men who I was interviewing were under constant surveillance, constant watch, and never had a chance where they really had a place where they could debrief and deal with some of the things of what it means to be black and male in Milwaukee. What I found from that initial study was that these men did have multiple children. They had a variety of custodial care patterns for their children. There was about a third of my sample was married and may have been married and now never got divorced, but now with a whole new family. Many of them were cohabiting. But the two biggest things that were really stood out for me that I've continued since my work in 2002 with this study was looking at support and barriers to employment, but also the significant issue of incarceration for non-payment of child support, which is what I discovered in this work. And again, I'm very grateful to IRP that allowed me to be able to publish that, because there was some pushback from the state when I first came out with it saying, we don't put people in jail. True, with child support as an office, you don't put people in jail. But there is a process that does lead to someone being incarcerated, which is what I was trying to understand when I was doing this work. One of the things that's very significant, too, about some of this work along the time period of I was doing my work is that we looked at, there's a study done by Elaine Sorensen that is quoted often from 2007 about who does pay child support. And because child support is has a mechanism of wage garnishment that is so very efficient, it's totally run by computers. That if you have money, they will find it some kind of way, unless you have some really fancy lawyers who can get you away with not paying your child support. So those who have money, and because of the new hire registry that's out there from 1996, people know you have a job. So if you have money, you'll pay your child support. Those who don't pay child support generally don't have any money. That's the issue there. And the other thing about the incarceration part of this is there's civil contempt and there's criminal child non-payment. With the civil, basically as my wife and other attorneys I've worked with, and I'm working in a project right now with Professor Tanya Brito at UW Law School, which is an NSF grant we got, you have the key. The key is money. So if you want to get out of jail, just pay the money. And in understanding that whole idea of civil contempt as someone who is a social worker now and becoming an academic, I had to understand, so who does it? So he doesn't have the money, where does it come from? Well, it comes from his mother or his aunt or his uncle or someone who doesn't want him to stay in jail. Very similar to what happened to Walter Scott. He let his family know, I'm about to go to jail, but I don't want to go to jail, so I'm going to flee. And his family was someone who often would bail him out of jail. And that's the issue there, that somebody is paying for them to get out of jail, but it's also just further impoverishing that family in ways that it's not helpful for the children or for anyone else. The other thing that I want to share is I have a really good colleague named Mark Levine who has looked at Milwaukee over the last 40 years in terms of how do you look at this issue of jobs and whether or not it's been there and available for people in the city of Milwaukee. So during the period of time that I was doing my work, you see that, and it's in the 90s and the 2000s, you can see that blacks males between ages of 16 and 64, the employment levels were going down for everybody, but more significantly for black men. They were losing industry in the city. They were losing lots of opportunities. Skill levels were not the same. And unfortunately, we have one of the worst graduation rates for black males in the city. So all of these confounding issues kind of intersect into looking at, getting the picture of what we have right now. And the one thing, I wrote this down to make sure I didn't forget what I'm supposed to say. The one thing that Mark shared with me, I want to say, Mark, I want to be sure to give you some credit, but I can't find the right, it's the employment population ratio. I'm not an economist, obviously, but he said he does his work looking at the whole idea of the employment population ratio to give you a better idea of what does the unemployment really look like based on race and gender. And so when you look at Milwaukee, we're pretty bad in terms of how black men are able to take care of their families. And in the communities that I did most of my research and continue to do my research, the men are about anywhere from 65 to 75% unemployed. And I just spent a lot of time in communities. I'll sit in barbershops, I'll sit in bars, I'll sit on the corners, stand around, walk around, always having to be careful not to be seen on a regular because police stop me a lot. Sometimes police stop me now as a joke because they know me and they know that, but I still don't say I'm a researcher, but they hear me on the radio or they know that I do work at UW. But I had to also be very careful that when I'm going to someone's home that they don't follow me because I could then be subpoenaed to court to tell what I've been told in my work. So it's been not just stressful for the men I work with, but it's also stressful for me, to be honest. Because even despite my degree, despite who I am, I'm only seen as another one of those black men that lives in Milwaukee. Because I don't have a suit and tie on, which doesn't make a difference anyway. But I'm still seen as just another black male who lives in Chicago, who lives in Milwaukee, who has these issues, and we need to figure out how to make sure we stop those issues. One thing I've done in moving into my newer work this last 2 years in particular is I've taken a life course perspective from a theoretical stance and looking at what are some of the experiences that will affect someone's ability to be employed, to be involved with their children. What are some of the trajectories or transitions or turning points, has been this key word that Dr. Schulpetzis has really been pushing in my head, that really makes a difference into whether or not someone's going to be able to be self-actualized, to be the person they can need to be, to take care of their family and take care of themselves. So I've been really learning a lot more about the whole life course perspective and what that means, and looking at how that can be incorporated from a policy perspective in terms of what are some of the things that policies do that may trigger trauma or make their lives a lot worse. Not saying, and so for me, the issue of child support is not a traumatic experience, but I'm definitely starting to see that I feel child support triggers any previous trauma you may have experienced in your life, any types of harm or where you feel you're not safe in your life, based on how the policy plays itself out with certain groups of people. Our research design was a mixed method study. We only interviewed 18 years and older men. We were able to have a convenience sample where I went to the Milwaukee Area Workforce Investment Board, where they provide services for those who are seeking employment. I thought it made a lot of sense to go somewhere where men are able to define themselves as being the breadwinner or being contributing to society when they're working. As many of you feel, I'm sure in this room, that your work defines who you are and what you're about. And for many of these men, that's the same. They have the same type of feeling. Work defines them as who they are and what's their value in their family and in society. We did this work from August to September 2013. We collected data on 195 people to get an idea of what it looks like. I did interviews and focus groups. The following year, I interviewed about 8 different men, and I did 4 to 5 different focus groups. I also talked to the administrators of the program, the staff. I talked to some of the community members of this program, in the area, to see what they thought about this program. And also I was able to access some administrative data from IRP. And also I had an advisory board who I fed information to, who were key stakeholders in the state. I had the governor's office, I had the local city health department, I had some criminal justice people involved, I had people on the site involved, and I had some community people involved. So I wanted to really get an idea of what do people think about this as a place to get jobs, but also what do they think about these men? That to me was really important to understand. What do people think about this particular group of men in terms of their ability to help their children and to be engaged in their children's lives? The survey measures we did were very health-focused in nature, because our money came from UW-Madison's Public Health and Medical School. They have a community university partnership. I do a lot of community university partnerships, and luckily I have an appointment with UW-Madison as well as UW-Milwaukee, which allows me to access funds in Madison and Milwaukee, and I took advantage on doing that because of my affiliation with both universities. And so we had people talk about their general health, their behavioral health, whether or not they understood or how they looked at depression and anxiety. There was also a racism scale. We looked at adverse childhood experiences, and also we looked at some issues around self-sufficiency that they did. And all of my undergraduate research assistants were administrators of this particular survey to the men, and the men also received $25 as a thank you for their time for participating in this particular research project. The men were 18 to 63. They were predominantly African American. 6% of them were married. 36% reported fathering no children. 60% had 1 or more children. Only 45% of them had completed high school. And 75% of these men reported earning less than $10,000 a year. So I had a very poor sample, and so Jeffrey's work really set it up that we were doing some kind of triangulation, but as we call it in the qualitative world, we have to triangulate it to make sure I'm not just making it up. He helped me a lot, and thanks to him for that work, and also helping you see that this is a reality in this community that we're working in. The one way I wanted to also verify that it was true, I asked for the unemployment wages or earnings of the men who were in the sample I had One thing I did was I asked men if they would be willing to give me their Social Security numbers so I can do some information checking on just one. I always need to verify what are you saying to me. So I wanted to be sure that if they were willing to give me their Social Security numbers, and I would then destroy them once I got the information, I was able to go to IRP and ask them if I could get information on 88 men who did agree to do that. And so this, of the 88 men of the sample, almost 50% of them, this was the unemployment wages that I received on average and median wages, and the range, and also the ranges of what their wages were. So obviously a very poor sample is accessing the Workforce Investment Board for a job. These men really want a job. They have not really had any real income. Some of them did have what you would call a decent salary, but they're a very, very poor sample. But they still had the motivation and the drive to go be part of this employment agency. Our questions were looking at the health status of these men seeking services, the prevalence of adverse childhood experiences, because that right now is telling us a lot about who these men are and whether or not in their childhood there's something that may lead to reasons that they may be substance abusers or may be incarcerated or may be having other issues that will not allow them to be very engaged in their children or their own lives. And also to look at the health status in terms of how does that mediate this relationship between the adverse experiences and incarceration or employment difficulties. And it was, again, primarily a study looking at African-American men. In the MAWIB, they do have people who are not just African-American accessing the services, but for the purpose of this grant, we wanted to look at just only African-American men. One of the things that we did find in terms of self-sufficiency, that these men had a lot of them had very poor work histories, over 52% of them, and also 50% of them had an incarceration history. Because of those two interacting factors, we found that it also meant they had a hard time being self-sufficient, which pretty much is common sense, but we heard it earlier from our previous presenters that those are some of the things that interact with each other that doesn't allow for people to be able to take care of themselves. And incarceration, I'm finding, has this much bigger effect on people's lives. So one thing I wanted to mention before I forget is that one of the things that was mentioned is that education makes a big difference in people's lives, and I know that a lot of scholars have written about that. And I have a lot of the men in these studies that I've done where they've gone to a community college or they've gone to even UW-Milwaukee, and they'll come to me because they know I do child support work and say, you know, I have to drop out of school because my grant was garnished. And that's one of the things that child support does. People are trying to further education, and child support is looking for money from everybody. And so if you're trying to go to school and you're in one of these men, your grant can be garnished. And you owe not only the tuition, but now you have no grant and you can't go to school. So it's this whole issue of what does incarceration do, but also what does a policy do that can make your life a lot more stressful, as opposed to the goal really being to help everybody in that family and also that person. So we looked at physical health, behavioral health, and mental health in this particular finding. And we were comparing the U.S. average with the site that I did in Milwaukee. On the physical health, they tend to do a little slightly less than the U.S. average on how their health status is, and also, again, this is self-report. So we're basing on what they've said, but there also are standardized tests that are using to collect this information. We find we have a higher group, we have a group that utilizes a lot more cigarette smoking, therefore they're less healthy. Also, we have them 3 times or more higher in their drug abuse use, which also contributes to them being less healthy and able to probably maintain a job over time. We also find that depression is very high amongst this group of sample that we interviewed, and anxiety is also very high. So when you look at what are some of the factors that contribute to your well-being, for this particular group of men who no one has really ever looked at around what is their health status, and these are men making less than $10,000, we're seeing people who have a lot of challenges that are not going to enable them to live a healthy life. But also, this issue of mental health is something that I think is a really big issue, not particularly amongst the men I see, where it's becoming almost normalized to be in a state where you just are always sad. And people don't recognize that there is a space where you can be happy. It may sound common sense or just like, of course, but I think we have not really recognized the agency that some of these men bring to their families and to their community. The one thing that we found very interesting was looking at the ACEs study. Now, the ACEs was first done in San Diego with a very large population of people. and it was done with primarily white people. It's very few, no one's really ever done it with just predominantly low-income black men who are making the amount of money that we're doing. There was a sample size, of course, that was black in this sample that we were comparing it to, but for this low-income group, no one's ever done that, and we're hoping that the paper we have out there gets published very soon, because we found, but the findings we have are really quite telling. And also I'm doing this particular study not just in Milwaukee, I'm also doing this same information on ACEs in St. Louis. So I wanted to compare my two samples as to how they looked when they've taken the ACEs study. So when you look at the categories of abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, black males in this particular group are doing much worse than anyone else. Sometimes 3, 4, 7 times worse than the general sample that was out there that we're comparing it to. Some of the highlights that we were surprised by is the sexual abuse part of this. I know that in my interviews I've had with men, they have never talked about it, and I'm not someone trained to listen to someone talk about their sexual abuse that's been happened to them as a child. So it's been very hard for me to sit through those interviews, and I've had to take a break because I'm now trying to write up my qualitative findings. But there's issues that these men may confront in prison, they may confront through the child welfare system, and they may confront in their neighborhood that they're walking around as hurt people. And really, it's one of the things that my friend tells me named John Rich, who's a dean at Drexel University in the School of Public Health, hurt people hurt people. And so we're not recognizing some of the things that men are walking around with on a regular basis, but we expect them to be normal, however we define that, and to do things that we think are acceptable, such as pay child support, keep a job, take care of your family, have a house. I mean, some of that stuff is hard to do when you haven't dealt with some of the things that are really confronting you on a regular basis. The other thing is that we found is that emotional and physical abuse is very high for this group. Our St. Louis sample, for some reason, was somewhat strange. We don't know why we had such a low number, and we're trying to rethink what we did wrong in that sample for that question. But we found that as an issue. The amount of experience with the incarcerated household member is like 10 times higher than the national sample, which is an issue of what does that mean when you see people in your home being incarcerated? How does that affect your economic security as a family? Because the thing that you will find that these issues of criminal justice surveillance in these very poor families is very expensive. Probation and parole fees are not cheap. And the whole idea of going back to jail is a big issue. Also, the issue of mental health is an issue that we saw higher in St. Louis, so we're looking at what was going on there. But also issues of substance abuse as a way to mediate some of the pain people may have is also very high in these communities that we're working with. So we've written up some preliminary work, and there's a lot more that's even here. But I wanted to share this with you because, again, a lot of stuff is not available to the public yet because we're trying to make sure we get our articles out there first. But just want to give you an idea that this is a sample that people haven't really thought of as having many issues because we generally think of men in terms of masculinity definitions as being okay. And we don't think of men as having issues that they're dealing with. But this is just an insight into that. The one thing we also are finding that when you look at the ACE index score, the more compound your ACE index score, the more at risk you are for other things not working out well, such as employment and risk for incarceration. It's not the only factor, but it has some relationship to those two types of outcomes. So when we look at this sample, the majority of the men have 4 or more experiences with those previous issues of adverse childhood experiences I showed you previously. So they don't just, most people, there's very few that have this 0, but the majority of people, as you look, will have had experience maybe incarceration, physical abuse, there's some kind of issues of separation in their household, and something else. So we find a lot of the men just have a combination of what makes for a more volatile situation. And so we're really much more interested in this, even though that's bringing insight to the previous one. We want to look at how does this affect you when you have multiple ACE scores. So one of the things that we saw that is substance abuse as a behavioral index, it may partially mediate the nexus between if you had an adverse childhood experience and whether you're incarcerated, which means that it doesn't necessarily mean you're definitely going to be someone who abuses substances, but if you had an adverse experience, there's a good chance that there may be some related substance abuse. And also there may be some related issues of incarceration. But what we did find, though, and this goes to something that Dr. Franklin said earlier, the incarceration part is such a strong variable around people's ability to function, around employment and taking care of themselves. But the substance abuse issue is something we didn't find necessarily, particularly if they had an early adverse childhood experience, affected their employment. You know, you could be someone who could be the weekend drinker, and you go to work and be fine all week. So that wasn't necessarily an issue, but when you bring in this issue of an adverse child experience and incarceration and substance abuse, then you have a little bit more of an issue around whether or not this is what leads to your unemployment or may cause some unemployment issues. Some of the early qualitative findings that I've done is that I asked the men their early life experiences, their current life status, and their employment-related challenges. And what I have found in my interviews with the men is that the issues of violence is so very high. That's all we can talk about for the first 30 minutes is what exposure to violence they have, from seeing their friend shot in front of them, to having someone in their family die, to witnessing domestic violence in their household, for either being their parent or someone else. It's just like that is just the running theme that I've seen through all my interviews, and the extent of it is just unbelievable. The amount of violence that people live under on a regular basis in these communities that people generally don't go into. I'm one of the few people that does that because of my work, but I have to admit it's getting a lot less safe. I feel a lot less safe than I've felt in the past when I've done it over the last 20 years. And also I felt a lot more cautious to have my students go do it with me or to do it by themselves. I don't really know how to navigate the way I used to as a qualitative researcher. So that's been something I've been trying to feel, how do I deal with that? There's also a large sense of hopelessness. Many of these men have not seen success in their life a lot. They feel they're always under surveillance. Someone's always watching them for what they do, how they act, what they wear. It's always that they're this subject on a regular basis. Work history is a big issue. Work history is an issue for like a Walter Scott who had a well-paying job at $35,000 a year in 2003. He went to jail for non-payment of child support and hasn't had a good job since then. And that's what I see with the men I talk to as well. And a policy that means well to help take care of children and reduce poverty has this really weird effect, or unintended effect, I must say, on very poor men who really can't navigate in the same way that someone has funds that can do that. So therefore, it affects their whole life in a way that we need to think about. Housing is a big issue. These men don't have secure housing. They may be living at their mama's house, their aunt's house, their girlfriend's house, their sister's house. It's hard to keep track of where they're at because housing is an issue for them. And once they have an incarceration or any kind of felony or misdemeanor on their, it's hard to get an apartment. Also, you know, credit history is an issue. And so it's just an issue more for the men. And we don't really have a social welfare system that really helps these men to be able to take care of themselves, or any single adult to take care of themselves. Job insecurity I've already mentioned, but also the issue of transportation is a big issue in Milwaukee in particular. When men want to go have jobs in the suburbs where there's plenty of jobs, they're often stopped by the police. They may be driving a car that doesn't look right, or they need to get a taillight fixed, or whatever it may be, or the police are saying, why are you going over here? That's a real issue. So they don't get to those jobs and they're not able to take care of their family. So this has been the running themes I've had across all of my interviews. And again, I'm writing this up right now with my colleague to submit for publication. One of the guys said to me, you know, my rent is $500 a month, and you know, I know she needs to get her money to survive as well. And he's living with his mother. She's a retired person, and she's been a blessing to me. She's one of my mother's best, I'm sorry, he lived with his mother, getting my interviews mixed up. He's living with his mother's best friend who has an apartment building. And she's one of my mother's good friends, so she's been giving me the last leg, a little bit of leg to hold on. So these men depend a lot on the good nature of people to help them out on a regular basis because, again, people tend to see them as not worthy. And I just talked to someone the other day about this work, and they were saying, you know, David, I don't even use the word non-custodial anymore when I talk about this work because as soon as people hear non-custodial, this negative thing pops up where they start saying whatever it is negative. So she said, I just say these fathers. And to be honest, I sort of use the word more fathers than non-custodial myself to get just people to give me entry to talk to people. He says, you know, right now I feel bad because I haven't been able to man up to go talk to this lady because I don't have any money. What's the issue? He felt embarrassed or scared, but he was trying to get a transitional job at MAWIB, and he was going to tell her about that, so that gave him some time. He brought him some time to be able to take care of himself. I really don't have a whole lot of recommendations that make all the greatest sense, but I know we're supposed to do this when we do a talk. But I think it's important. I just think it's important that people know, and for me right now, the thing I'm finding out the most after all these years of doing this work is knowing the men who participate in these programs and who they are and what they bring to the table. It's the only way you can provide the best service to these families and these men. If you don't know who they are and you're making some assumption that they can work, that they have a job, that they have access, it's a big issue. provide better access to economic opportunities. I think it's just really important to understand the child support system and its impact on low-income families and children. Of course, the usual way of looking at success in child support is that we collected money, and that's one part of it. But what is it doing to someone who's seeing what is it doing to kids who see their parents constantly under stress of worrying about, I don't have a driver's license because it's been garnished. I don't have a fishing license. I don't have a hunting license. I have a lien on my car. I have a lien on my house. I'm at risk for being arrested. That's something I would love to be engaged with some child welfare people on. Just child well-being, what does that really mean? Look at a way to provide better, adequate, and safe housing. And finally, to provide access to health and mental health services for childless adults. We're in a state where they don't take the Medicaid money to provide that service. We do a pretty good job through Badger Care. And also we do a good job with our current way of how we do provide services for childless adults. But I really would advocate for more services to these men so they can be able to take advantage of those services and take care of themselves and take care of their families. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. I want to first thank La Follette Institution and Marquette, La Follette Institute and Marquette University, as well as Susan specifically. Although Bob, all I got was a cup of tea, so I'm feeling a little, I'm feeling like I could at least have gotten something to eat. So as way of background, my training is in sociology, but largely in criminology and the criminology of inequality. And so that reflects how I approach the issue and what motivates my work and how I think about some of the issues. So as an overview, I want to talk about the expansion of the penal system. I want to look at the expansion of the penal system relative to earlier periods in American history, as well as the expansion of the penal system in terms of how many people are cycling in and out of the system. And I'm going to make some comparisons to the education system in the United States, both the system of higher education as well as spending on K through 12 education. I'm going to talk a little bit about who's most impacted by the expansion of the prison system. And when possible, I'm going to focus on Wisconsin. I grew up in Stevens Point. I was on faculty at Penn State for 5 years before coming to Wisconsin. And so what happens in Wisconsin is interesting both intellectually and from a personal standpoint. I want to think broadly about the consequences of incarceration. In most of the examples I'll talk about, I'll review work in the area, not specifically dive into the individual work that I've done, but if people want to talk about that, I'm very happy to. And I'll end with a brief, as long as we'd like to talk, question and answer. And I'll keep my eye on the time so we don't go too far off cue. First, let's think a little bit about the scope of the system. And what I argue is the prison has emerged as a social institution. And when we think of social institutions, we're thinking about things like the education system, the healthcare system, the labor market. Approximately 1 in every 100 adults is incarcerated. That is a bit dated. That was done by Pew in 2008. Right now it's about 1 in every 99, but that's less interesting than 1 in every 100. And that's a study that everybody knows. And so if you think about, is that a lot of people? Well, you could think about the system of higher education. And if we took all the systems all the students in the UW system, as well as I don't know what the Big Ten is anymore, it's like 14 schools, but we took everybody in the Big Ten, as well as the Pac-10, the Big East, the SEC, the ACC, the Big 12, and the Ivy League. So if we took everybody at all the Wisconsin systems and every research university in the country, all those students, that's about the size of the prison system right now. Approximately the same number of African American men are enrolled in four-year institutions as are incarcerated in jails and prisons. And I want, as a criminologist, I'm interested, and I think it's important from a policy perspective to understand some of the distinctions between some of the broad things that we talk about. So for instance, most of my talk is going to be about prisons. Most of the data that we talk about, when we think about the expansion of the prison system, it's about prisons. Jails are a fundamentally different process. You can go to jail and never been convicted of a crime. You can go to jail and not be convicted of a felony. So for instance, you can spend a year in jail. O.J. Simpson spent a year in jail but was not convicted of any crime in relation to the murder of Nicole Brown Simpson. It also has important policy implications. So for instance, Grover's right. We might spend too much money on marijuana, but those people are not in prisons. We arrest about 750,000 people a year for marijuana violations, but the prison population is only about 2% marijuana users. It's all about what's happening in jails, and it's all about arrests. And even those marijuana users, largely sellers. Kids are not going to prison for marijuana use. They're going to jails and being arrested for marijuana use. I also want to talk a little bit about felons and ex-felons, because it matters. Felon is someone who's convicted of what we consider to be a serious crime in the United States, punishable by at least a year in prison. Ex-felons are generally people who have that in the past, but they are off paper. They are no longer on probation. They are no longer on parole. These distinctions are important because in some areas, for instance, you can't vote if you're a felon. In some places, you can't vote if you've ever been convicted of a felony. So understanding what different groups of people we're talking about is quite relevant. When we linking some of those ideas back to the prison system and comparing the prison system to the education system, many states in straight up dollars and cents, spend more money on incarceration than higher education. And those are some big states like California, New York, and Pennsylvania. If you look at it on a per capita basis, everybody. Okay, I might not touch this again. Everybody spends more on incarceration per individual on incarceration than they do on education and educating our young. So these are K through 12 state investments in individuals in K through 12 compared to state investments in incarcerating individuals. What you see in Wisconsin is we spend about $10,000 for every state investment in every student, and we spend about $25,000 for every person that we lock up. So we a metric of about 2.5 times more money per inmate than we do per student. The expansion is particularly notable, I would say, for three, but there are many, many more. The expansion is particularly notable for three reasons. It's relatively recent, basically happened in the last 3 years. When I teach, when I ask my students at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I say, what's the most important thing that's happened in your life? I often argue the most important policy shift in their lives has been the expansion of the penal system. It has absolutely fundamentally changed how we understand inequality in the United States. The expansion is not equal. It's disproportionately poor, urban minority men. And the expansion is largely decoupled from crime rates, and that is a point that's often lost. Crime rates have been steadily going down at the same time incarceration rates are going up. People can ask, and I can talk in more depth about the question during the Q&A, are the crime rates going down because incarceration rates are going up? Like, is there a causal link? That link is tenuous at best, but we can talk about it in more depth if we'd like. So when I say it's recent, it began roughly in the mid-1980s, roughly. Since that period in time, the federal prison population has gone up over 700%, and spending in the federal prison has gone up over 1,700%. All states have seen an expansion of the penal system. There is, of course, greater variation when you have 50 states as opposed to one central government. But if you were to average the effects, you'd say state populations went up roughly 400 to 500%. Roughly 400 to 500%. It's important to note, and it has relevance for the work that everyone has talked about, the swelling of the correctional population is across different classes. Prisoners are up. Felons are up. Non-felons are up. People convicted of misdemeanors are up. People with an arrest history are up. How fast and how recent? So this is one of the few times, this is a case where I combine jails and prisons together. How fast and how recent? You see, roughly in the 1980s, it went up dramatically. It's important to note that the jail population and the prison population almost by definition trend together, right? It's impossible to decouple the two. But when we talk about the mass incarceration, we're generally talking about this. And the reason we're generally talking about this is all the collateral consequences. You can't vote, can't live in certain places. That's associated with a felony conviction. Now, what becomes even more interesting is I went back and I said, how far back can you go? And I went to it's called the Source Book of Criminal Justice Records, hosted at the University of New York at Albany, from about 1880 in our country's history to, if you give me just a little bit of latitude, to about 1980, the incarceration rate was roughly flat. Now, of course, this isn't exactly flat, but for the purposes of the discussion, it's roughly flat. And then all of a sudden, it just took off, right? So we had a stable incarceration rate for almost the entirety of our nation's history until the last 3 years. You will see in the last 2 or 3 years, there's been some decreases in the prison population. I am less optimistic than other people are. I do not think that those are a result of policy shifts. We just don't have enough space. And places like California have forced the system to let certain folks go. So we do see some decreases. I think those decreases are a function of legal remedies and the dynamics that we just don't have enough space to continue the expansion. So what about Wisconsin? Well, on the plus side is Wisconsin started later than the rest of the country did. So it wasn't until about the mid-1990s that Wisconsin really started incarcerating. The problem is we caught up very quickly. So Wisconsin's rate was comparatively flat for the first 15 or 20 years of the expansion, and then we caught up rather dramatically to the point now where we lock up essentially twice as much as our neighbor to the west, Minnesota. So we have a rate currently in Wisconsin of about 366 per 100,000. So I said for the most part, I'm not talking about my work. I put a caveat by it because it's me, so you can view it with even greater skepticism. That was a joke. Okay, so what we tried to do is calculate how many felons are there in the United States. And it's actually a pretty complicated thing to do because for the most part, when people are off paper, we don't keep track of them anymore. Felons go back to prison, felons die, felons move, so we had to make all sorts of different adjustments. And what we found right now is there are about 5 million people actively as felons. This is a pretty easy, the bottom chart, this is pretty easy to calculate. About 5 million people currently incarcerated or on paper in the United States, and there are about 20 million ex-felons in the United States. That becomes very consequential when you think about the collateral consequences of incarceration, like not being able to vote in some jurisdictions. Not shockingly, of course, the overall trend mirrors the rise in incarceration. So who is most impacted? So I apologize, some of the graphs didn't come through as clearly as I'd like. Women are impacted, but this is largely a story of men, right? This is largely a story of men. And it is largely a story of minority men, where we see rates of incarceration, straight rates of incarceration for African American men are roughly 8 times that for whites. There is some variation by state, there is some variation by the federal level, and rates of incarceration for African American men are approximately 3 times the rate of that for Hispanic men on average. Here's when it starts to become more problematic and more concentrated. If you add disadvantage, and the disadvantage where they chose to add in this case was you had education. So if we consider education, the top line here, and we're looking at men born between 1975 and 1979. In general, using Dr. Wilson talked about the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, 1979. 1997. There is also a National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, 1979. So this is the older data. People are quite a bit older. African American men without a high school degree have a lifetime probability of going to prison of about 70%. African American men, all education levels, have a probability of about 20%. Now, when you compare those rates to white males, white male dropouts have a probability of going to prison about 15%. All white males have a probability of going to prison of about 3 or 4%. Okay? So what you see is it is concentrated among African Americans, and it is particularly concentrated among African Americans who have other metrics of disadvantage. And the disadvantage I chose here was education. Folks have now started to say, for poor African American men, incarceration is a phase in the life course, thinking of some of the life course literature that Professor Pate has talked about. What about children? Okay? So on the right-hand side, we see African American children. On the left-hand side, we see white children. And what we're seeing here is, by the time you're 14, what's the probability your dad's in prison? Okay, that's essentially what we're looking at. And what you see is that white children whose father is a high school dropout have about, by the time they're 14, less than a 10%, between a 7 and an 8% chance of seeing their father in prison. In contrast, African American kids whose father were high school dropouts, 50-50, that their dad will be in prison by the time they're 14. Okay, we're talking about early, significant disadvantage that's impacting not only the people going to prison, but impacting the children and the families. How does Wisconsin compare? Wisconsin does not compare well. We are, in terms of racial disproportionality, the worst state in the union. Okay? So, in the U.S. Census, 2010 census, as a percentage of the population, the male population, 13% of Wisconsin's black males were incarcerated. Okay? We are the worst state in the nation. So, overall, national average is about 6%. We double the national average, and we have the highest rates in the country. Okay, so Wisconsin doesn't do well. So this just looks at it slightly different. This is Wisconsin. I apologize, some of the graphs didn't come through as clearly as I would have liked. Almost 12%, national average is 6%. Native Americans, 7%, average is again 3%. So in terms of racial disproportionalities, Wisconsin is the worst, and for what it's worth, Milwaukee and Dane County are the two worst offenders in the state of Wisconsin. Dane County being worse in general. Why? In general, what's driving the racial disproportionality is incarceration rates. This is old data, but the data holds for a decade later. In essence, African Americans are locked up at the greatest disproportionality for drug offenses, at a rate literally hundreds of times higher than whites, okay? More than any other thing, drug offenses are what's driving racial disproportionality. What's also noteworthy and important is this is largely decoupled from crime. So here we're plotting the violent victimization in the United States since 1993, and what you see is it's down 72 to 75%, depending on how you characterize violent victimization, okay? But what we see is at the same period that there has been an unprecedented expansion of the penal system, there has been an almost equally unprecedented decrease in crime in the United States. So the expansion of the penal system is not from a policy perspective, it's in response to some initiative that is not crime control. There's something else going on. So what's happened? We've created a new class in America, and it's not the middle class, it's not the working class. We've created a felon class in society. That constitutes 20 million felons in the United States. That's about 8.5% of the adult population in the United States, 22% of the black adult population in the United States, and about 34% of the black adult male population. And when you think about that, it's largely removed from crime. It has the greatest disparity is around drug crimes, and it has had an absolutely transformative impact on American society. And most of my work looks empirically at the consequences of the expansion of the penal system on families, communities, and individuals. When we think about the implications of the expansion of the prison system, we most often think about that in terms of reintegration, people coming back to the communities. We care, some would argue, we care about how many people are in prison, but we really care about people getting out of prison. So how many people get out of prison a year? About 700,000 people. Is that a lot? Well, let's compare it to the education system again. I went to the National Center for Education Statistics, and they have just reams and reams and reams of data. And so I just found the first one that I said, okay, I got it, right? So according to the National Center for Education Statistics in 2008, roughly 678,000 men got 4-year degrees, okay? 678,000 men got 4-year degrees. So what that means is every year, more men are getting out of prison. And if you were to, let's say roughly the same number, of that 700,000, 30,000 might be women who are getting out, right? It's a very small percentage of the overall pie. So in essence, about the same number of men are getting out of prison every year as are graduating college in the United States. I was sort of curious, wanted to compare it to the University of Wisconsin-Madison specifically. The University of Wisconsin-Madison claims about 400,000 living alumni. And in the history of the institution, according to the registrar, who you would think keeps relatively good data on these things, the University of Wisconsin-Madison has granted about 545,000 undergraduate degrees, okay? So we can think about it like this. In 1 year, more people, about the same number of men get out of prison as graduate college. And in the history of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, in 1 year, more people get out of prison than they have educated and put their stamp on in the entire history of the institution, okay? So it is a big, big, big part of how we understand, a big part of life. Now, of course, the impact of incarceration is concentrated among a number of different dimensions. It's concentrated racially, it's concentrated educationally, it's concentrated economically, and it's concentrated geographically. And how we understand the consequences of incarceration is often tied to those specific concentrations. And what I want to do for the last 10 minutes or so is just talk about the consequences of incarceration. I say with no hesitation, I don't know that I'm smart, other than I was smart enough to study a good topic. Because whatever you're interested in as it relates to incarceration, the effect is bad. Okay? So you can think about all sorts of individual level effects. Now, there are a couple caveats. You can think about all the individual level effects. You can think about all the family level effects. You can think about all sorts of community level effects. And the literature on incarceration is expanding almost as fast as the prison system did in the early 1990s. It's just absolutely ballooning. And what I'd like to do is go through each of these areas individually and focus on maybe one or two studies that might be particularly relevant for people in the room. What's important to consider is across almost all outcomes, the most disadvantaged groups are the most likely to be impacted, okay? Across almost all outcomes, incarceration both creates new levels of inequality and perpetuates historical patterns of disadvantage, okay? So what do I mean by that specifically? Let's talk about individual level outcomes first. And so this is becoming sort of common knowledge. Incarcerated individuals have a much harder time getting jobs. If they get a job, they start at lower wages and their wage growth is lower. Incarcerated individuals come from and return to the most disadvantaged neighborhoods in the country. Incarcerated individuals have worse health outcomes. I put a star next to the health outcomes because that was what I wrote my dissertation on. That's primarily what I do most of my work on, patterns of infectious disease transmission. How much does the incarceration system contribute to patterns of infectious disease transmission? There are a few situations where when people go to prison, they get a short-term bump in their health functioning, okay? That tells you just how disadvantaged these individuals were before prison, that the healthcare in prison actually represents something better for them. There are a few instances where a meal in a warm place to sleep actually increases health outcomes. So there are the overall effect on health is negative, but there are some areas, women in particular, show greater increases in health when they go to prison. So there are a few areas where health outcomes in the short term are better. In the long term, they're almost always negative. So when we're thinking about employment, there was an audit study done in Milwaukee, and there was an audit study done by a very, very well-known student at the University of Wisconsin named Diva Pager. She's at Harvard now. And what she did was look for manufacturing jobs in the Milwaukee newspaper, and she sent in applications, she sent in applications. People obviously didn't know that it was research, but what she did was create identical job applications, but for race and criminal history. All the other factors in the study Diva made equal, okay? So educational background were equal, work history were equal, and what Diva wanted to see is how do people get called back for interviews for low-level manufacturing jobs in Wisconsin with a criminal history, and does that vary by race? Those are the questions that she asked. So she wanted to see who got called back for an interview. And here's what she found. 34% of whites got called back for a job. About 17% of whites with a criminal record got called back for a job. So you see a 50% decrease in the likelihood you called back for an entry-level job in Wisconsin, in Milwaukee, if you had a criminal record. How did that translate for African Americans? African Americans with no record, 12% of them got called back, and those with a criminal record, only 5% got called back. Now, this was one of the early and transformative studies in the area. Howard Dean, among others, championed the study when he was running for president. And what's interesting is when you look across, when you look across the line, you see that incarceration creates inequality, right? It lowers by 50% the likelihood that you get a job. But you also see that incarceration reinforces historical patterns of inequality because it's African Americans who are disproportionately punished, to the extent that whites with a record are more likely, at least in one study, to be called back for a job than African Americans without a record. And African Americans with a record have virtually no, and this was in 2006, virtually no likelihood of gainful employment. Okay, if we were to think about family functioning, it is not shocking to anyone that, for instance, if your partner goes to prison, you're more likely to get a divorce, okay? So incarceration leads to divorce. That's not a shock. Incarceration leads to partner depression. Incarceration leads to less family wages. Incarceration increases the likelihood that children will grow up in poverty. But if we talk a little bit more about children, a book came out recently in 2013 called Children of the Mass Incarceration Boom. And the argument that they make is a function of, this is differences now between African American kids and white kids, okay? That almost 40% of the difference in externalizing behaviors between white children and African American children is attributable to the damage of incarceration. It removes fathers from the household, lower wages. This is a book published by Oxford Press. And so what they're arguing is, in homelessness, almost 60% of the gap in homelessness between whites and African Americans is a function, African American kids, is a function of the incarceration system, according to the authors. So what they're saying is that not only, so it's rather provocative, but what they're saying is that now the incarceration boom has gotten so big that it is explaining broad differences between children, between white and black children, okay? They have another article coming out that looks at GPA gap, and they try to estimate how much of the GPA gap is a function of the incarceration of essentially parents. If we think about community level outcomes, incarceration disproportionately draws from and returns to the most disadvantaged neighborhoods in the country. More returning inmates in the given census tract has varied negative outcomes. So some of the outcomes we would expect, more returning inmates, higher rates of crime. Some of the outcomes we wouldn't expect, more returning inmates, higher levels of new infectious disease transmission, higher levels of new HIV rates in census tracts, okay? So what were we going to do in depth? Think a little bit. How am I for time, by the way?
You're almost at 5.
Okay, I'm almost at 5. So I have an extra slide that I'll just show you because it helps us think about the difference between felons and non-felons. So if we think about political participation, if we think about political representation, there is tremendous state variation, but felons commonly cannot vote. And you'll just excuse me for a second. I just threw a slide at the end that I didn't know if we'd have time to. So if in places like Florida, Tennessee, Virginia, some states out west, if you have ever been convicted of a felony, and this is why it's important to know how many ex-felons are out there. If you've ever been convicted of a felony, you can't vote. In places like Wisconsin, you can't vote if you're still on paper. And then if you look at places like Maine, there are actually PACs, political action committees, in prisons where people can vote while they're actually incarcerated. So there is tremendous variation in the impact in who can and can't vote. Okay. Nationally, around 6 million individuals can't vote, okay, nationally. That constitutes almost 8% of the African American voting age population. In places like Florida, West Virginia, greater than 20% of the African American voting age is disenfranchised. Many places like Wisconsin, it's greater than 10%. I think in the most recent estimates, it was like 10.7% in Wisconsin. That's about 10 times the African American rate. To say that you know, you don't have to be a historian to know that there was a pretty close election in 2000, and that the state of Florida was relatively relevant to determine the presidential outcome. Independent of where you fall ideologically, it's without question disenfranchising 23% of the African American population helped George Bush. Not helped. George Bush carried the state and would not have carried the state if that was not the case. The estimates are that currently 7 United States senators would not be senators if if there was no felon disenfranchisement, I think it's 27 congressional seats. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, and literally hundreds of state and local elections have been impacted. So the disenfranchisement policies impact who's the president of the United States, impact the composition of the Senate, impact the composition of congressional seats, as well as countless state and local elections. It is almost always in close elections in states with high percentage African Americans and with sort of, I don't want to put ideological value in it, but it is always in states with close elections and high percentage of African Americans and rather punitive policies. I do think it's, and I always hesitate to talk about this, but I do think it's important to keep in mind that some of these laws on felon disenfranchisement were enacted during the post-Civil War Reconstruction period. So, for instance, there is an article in the 2008 American Journal of Sociology published by my advisor, I love him and he's brilliant. So those were not jokes. But they went back and they looked at the record, and the actual law that barred felons from voting in Tennessee still had the language "to fight the menace of Negro domination" is still part of the original word, and that's in the title of his article, by the way. So it's often hard to infer intent, but it's not always that hard to infer intent. Sometimes they put it right in the letter of the law, and that was published in 2008 in the American Journal of Sociology, and it was "Ballot Manipulation and the Menace of Negro Domination" was the title of the article. So if I were to sort of summarize some conclusions, first off, it's always hard to give big picture talks about 50 states, a federal prison, and over 20 million people, right? So there's a ton of caveats. In some cases, there's been decreases in the rate of incarceration. Texas, for instance, has seen about a 9% decrease since 2010. Anyone familiar with Texas politics? It's not because they're soft on crime in Texas. It's because they just can't continue to lock that many people up anymore. I talked a little bit about some positive health outcomes. There are also positive community health outcomes. So, for instance, the higher the percentage of people released from prison, we have lower levels of some treatable infectious diseases like chlamydia, like hepatitis, like tuberculosis, okay? So we see that some people actually get treatment in prison, and in some cases it drives down state levels of overall infectious disease. So there are some good things masked in a sea of essentially corrosive effects. There's been a huge expansion of the penal system, and I say it's among the most important policy shifts in my lifetime and in the lifetime of those of us who are born in the last 3 or 4 decades. Where's Wisconsin? Well, in most things, Wisconsin's pretty close to the national average. We are very near the worst across almost all indicators of disparity, and we are worse when we compare ourselves to what we often think about as the similar states. Now, Charles is in a better spot than I am to talk about how similar we are to Minnesota. But when we look at Minnesota and Wisconsin, when we look at Wisconsin and Iowa, when we look at Wisconsin and other Midwest states, we tend to look worse. It's the really punitive states. When you draw on the punitive states and average it out, Wisconsin tends to look more kind of average. It's had broad, sweeping, and transformative impacts on American society, most acutely felt by those most disadvantaged. And it's important to keep in mind that there are 2 ways that incarceration has impacts. In one way, it's worse for minorities, and that's what you see with Diva Page's work, okay? The audit study, I don't know if I said Diva, the audit study. You see it's worse. African Americans are punished more severely. The other way is that the impact is the same, but because there's differential exposure. Look, all felons in Florida can't vote. So the impact is the same, independent of whether you're a white felon or a black felon. But because black individuals are so much more likely to be exposed to the justice system, the impact is differential by not because the effects are different, but because the weight, the exposure is so much different. And with that, I could stop and see if anyone had questions.
We have time for
So I want to thank the La Follette School and Marquette for inviting me here today.
I want to thank the four gentlemen who preceded me up here for some very stimulating and very interesting talks, from which I learned a fair amount. So I guess my job is to wrap things up. I was very pleased when I got the invitation because it's an opportunity for me to revisit this issue to some extent. I started working on this in the year 2000, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes, and I did a lot of work on this issue for about 6 or 7 years, so about 2006, 07. For a while, I worked with a guy named Paul Lochner, who I really wanted to mention while I was here. Some of you remember he was a state legislator here in Wisconsin in the 1970s, then came to Washington, and he was a wonderful colleague and co-author. He passed away very suddenly in 2004, but we did a lot of work on this issue before that time, and also some work I did with a couple of buddies from the West Coast, Steve Raphael and Michael Stoll, whom some of you know. And then after about 06, 07, I started drifting away from this and working on other things. I was very pleased to have the opportunity to come back and look at the issue again in 2015, sort of 15 years after I started, and to come back and take stock of where we are. And again, be informed by these very good presentations and really look at where we are in this issue, what's changed in that 15-year period, what's gotten worse, has anything gotten better at all, and then where do we stand right now as we try to move ahead from a policy point of view on some of these issues. So, whoops, yep. I'll do that. Okay. So I want to sort of quickly move through these 5 points. When you look at disadvantaged men broadly and non-custodial dads and ex-offenders specifically, how has the environment changed, both in terms of the economic and labor market environment, in terms of policy also? Secondly, very quickly, what do the overall numbers look like and what are the barriers? And I'm a labor economist. I'm going to focus mostly on barriers in the labor market, which are a subset of the much broader range of issues that Michael and David have talked about. Third, what have we learned in the meantime from the program evaluation literature, from the policy evaluation literature, about what might work? This is a tough population. And when we do things, we don't want to spend precious resources, financial or otherwise, unless you have some sense that these things really work. And the only way to tell that is from rigorous evaluation. So what have we learned from that evaluation? Have any positive things changed in the federal or state policy environment? And I think a few things have. Not enough, not nearly enough for our taste. And then going forward, what does this all mean? So I'll try to cover that in 20 or 25 minutes if I can. So let me go back to the year 2000. And 2000, I was in the Clinton administration Labor Department, and in the year 2000 I left and was just returning to a policy and a research agenda, and I was one of many people who sort of discovered this issue. Now, people working on these issues for a long time didn't need to discover them, but a lot of folks like me were not highly aware of the issues of offender and ex-offender and reentry issues, non-custodial parent issues, and the broader issue of disconnected young men. And all of a sudden, it seemed like there was a lot of talk about it in the years 1999 and 2000. And why all of a sudden at that point, you might ask, did people become aware? And I would say 2 things. Number one, we had this fabulous labor market in the late 1990s that we recall very wistfully. Very strong demand, wage growth. It really was a seller's market, meaning a worker's market. Employers were raising wages and still having trouble finding or retaining the workers they had. And by the way, if there was a single thing, if we could take a magic wand and say what policy change would have an enormous effect, very high in that list would be having a tight labor market, because it changes how employers feel about different populations. And employers went through all of the different groups of workers that they prefer and that they prefer less. And even at that point, they had to look at the end of the queue, the back of the queue. And the back of the queue is less educated black men in general, and these men with criminal records in particular. And at that point, they were starting to be willing to look at that population and to see, are there men in that group whom they could employ more broadly. And the other thing I think that was very striking, many of you will remember that we spent almost the entire decade of the 1990s talking about welfare reform. That was the red-hot issue. And how is that going to affect the moms, and how is that going to affect the kids? And many of us were fearful about welfare reform. Many of us thought the results were going to turn out worse than they did. We were somewhat surprised that late in the 1990s, after welfare reform passed and was implemented, actually, the results were a lot more positive. Combination of the tight labor market and expansions of earned income tax credits and other supports and welfare reform all together. But we also realized something else, that with all that focus on the moms and the kids, we hadn't been talking about the dads. And when we started looking at the dads, their numbers were actually getting worse, not better. And people started to realize if we really want to make these families whole and really improve their outcomes, you got to do something about the dads and about the men. You can't continue to ignore that. And so around that time, in the year 2000, many of us turned our attention to sort of focusing on these issues. Well, so what's changed since the year 2000? Really, what's different now? Then I would say three things. Number one, we have a much, much weaker job market, which is quite unfortunate. Employment rates have dropped. And by the way, we know it's been bad since 2008, since the Great Recession started. It was not great in the period 2000-2007. That was an entire cycle where we never even came close to the kind of highs that we had in the late 1990s in terms of job market performance. And employment is down and wage growth has been non-existent for almost anybody in the labor market. And we can talk about what changed in the labor market and what tipped the balance in favor of employers. But that's one thing that's changed. And of course, the second thing is there are a lot more ex-offenders and probably non-custodial dads. And I guess Michael's numbers on this were very clear. The numbers of ex-offenders continued to increase till about 2010. And then kind of flattened off and maybe declined slightly. But right now we're in a place where the numbers are higher. So we have a weaker job market, a lot more offenders and non-custodial dads in place. But in more positive things, I think since that time there's been a lot of research and a lot of good policy work. We know a lot more. We haven't necessarily implemented it in policy, but we know a good deal more about what works and what doesn't, that hopefully we can use to inform our actions if we want to move ahead on this. So what are some of the numbers? And again, I'm just going to very quickly run through. Some of these are well known. They are mostly consistent with what we've heard in previous presentations. About a third of all black men incarcerated at some point by age 35. It's a shocking number, I still think, by any measure. 2/3 of all black men who are high school dropouts are incarcerated by age 35. The incarcerated population overall is, on any given day, and including jail, people in jail as well as prisons, is over 2 million people, mostly men, over 2 million men on any day, plus about twice that number on parole or probation. So at any moment, somewhere in the range of 6 to 7 million men, mostly men, under the control under the supervision of the criminal justice system. And not to mention all the other men who are no longer under the supervision, but who now have that marker of a criminal record, which Michael's numbers said go up as high as 20 million or so. How many of those men are NCPs, non-custodial parents? Again, in the African American community, a very large number. Well over half of all black fathers are non-custodial. Numbers I've seen suggest over 70% of the men incarcerated are also non-custodial dads who have, so you have the double issue of the incarceration markers as well as the child support issues. And I want to mention a few other numbers because I want to talk about disconnected youth a little bit. And that's related. That's a broader population. What do we mean by that? Young men, young people, but young men especially, disconnected from both school and work. Not in school, but also not really connected to the labor market. There's different ways of defining that. I think it's appropriate to look at people who are not disconnected for 2 months or 3 months, but really at least 6 months to a year. And I usually throw out people that have some kind of college credential, an AA degree or anything like that. By the numbers, recently people have looked at these numbers, sort of say somewhere in the range of 6 to 7 million youth defined as being ages 16 to 24. That's about 1 out of every 6 young people. And that number did go way up during the recession because recessions are very bad for youth. Young people, more than any other group, get hit very hard during recessions. They're the most marginal group in the labor market, the first people to get laid off. So those numbers are up a lot right now. But the other thing I want to point out, there is this phenomenon of declining male participation in the U.S. labor force, and particularly less educated men with high school less education. It's been going on for quite a while. It's gotten worse since 2008, but it started well before. And there's different numbers on this as well. Since 2008, forget about the elderly who are retiring, the baby boomers in retirement. Since 2008 alone, we've lost nearly 2 percentage points out of the population of people participating in the labor force. And that's a shocking number. We don't know. At this point, we've seen very few of them coming back. And that seems to, and some of that's happening among women, but there's been a bigger long-term trend among men. And what seems to be going on is as the wages of that group stagnate or decline, young men respond to that by pulling out of the labor force. It's no longer worth it to work. Economists call that relation a labor supply curve. And as conditions in the labor market worsen, as wages get worse, people respond by pulling out of the labor market, maybe doing other things illegally, maybe going on disability, maybe working under the table a little bit. And of course, at this point, it's not just the phenomenon of African-American men or poor men. You see it increasingly in the white community, in the Latino community, in that less educated part. So that's a sort of a broad backdrop to this whole discussion. If we focus on the NCPs and the ex-offenders, that's in some sense the group that has had it worse. But now you're talking about a much larger group of people that are negatively affected by these adverse labor market outcomes that I think we want to be aware of. But again, so if we go back to the disconnected youth and the NCP and the offenders, what are the barriers that they face? What are the problems when they choose to enter the job market, as many of them do? There's a large body of research here, and as soon as I started to make this, I thought how much of this great research has actually been done historically at the University of Wisconsin, at the Poverty Institute, and at the La Follette School. And off the top of my head, I listed, the sort of at least 5 people whose work I think has been hugely important in this area. And I apologize to the people who I've left out, because again, this is off the top of my head, the people who came to mind, and along with other folks, Diva Pager, Bruce Western, myself, and some of my co-authors. And the way to think about this, I think, is think about a progression. You start with a group of young men who are at risk of dropping out and disconnecting from school and work. Those who are at risk, a lot of them actually do drop out and disconnect. And then out of that group, a very large number become non-custodial parents, and a serious chunk of those folks do end up with felony convictions and in prison. At each stage of the game, which additional barriers do they accumulate, and which problems? And I'm going to define barriers pretty broadly. And again, I'm going to think like a labor economist. There's some barriers that occur on the demand side of the job market, which is jobs and employers and what they're looking for, and their attitudes and unwillingness to hire from this population in general, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes not. And then I'm also talking about barriers on the supply side, the workers themselves, the history, the characteristics they bring to the job market, as well as any incentives or really disincentives they now face. Because I think you got to think about the demand side and the supply side to understand what's going on in the labor market for these folks and then what to do about it. So first we start with this group of at-risk young people. And of course we know low-income kids and African-American kids fall behind very early in life. And the process starts well below they set foot in kindergarten in terms of cognitive skills, word recognition, non-cognitive skills, etc. They get to the school system. The school system is supposed to narrow those things. Instead, they widen those gaps. So you have, at a very early age, these children developing relatively weak schools and in weak schools themselves. And so a lot of them do drop out. But even among those who manage to finish and get a high school diploma, their cognitive skills are going to be relatively weak. And in many cases, they're non-cognitive skills. And then, of course, they join the labor market at that point. Starting at the age of 16, a lot of people start to. And again, very quickly in the labor market, the gaps in the accumulation of work experience start to widen almost immediately. If you look at the NLSY data, every single year, the gap between black work experience and white work experience, it widens a little bit, but it keeps widening every year. And so the work experience gets weak, and the attachment to the labor market becomes very weak. Why is that? Well, some of that is because of the skills gap. And the greater difficulty, it's not really the problem of finding any job, but finding a job that's attractive and maybe has some future in terms of wage growth. But we know there's other things going on in the labor market as well, besides just skill gaps. We know there is labor market discrimination. It was very clear in the numbers Michael presented. There is labor market segregation and spatial mismatch, people living not anywhere close to where the jobs are and not really understanding the locations where the jobs exist, community issues, neighborhood problems, and I think the problem of weak employment networks and weak connections to the job market. And a lot of low-income young men today growing up not only in families where they do not know an adult male who's working, but oftentimes in their entire communities really seeing very few employed men from whom they can model themselves and whom they can use as a connection into the job market early on. So those problems, this is just those folks who are at risk of disconnecting. Then, of course, many of them do disconnect, drop out of school, avoid the formal labor market, and of course, many of them develop criminal records and become non-custodial dads. These then add to the barriers and the problems, the burdens that they walked into the situation with. So I listed 4 labor market barriers associated with having a criminal record over and above whatever skill problems and lack of work experience. So first of all, there are a whole range of federal and state laws. They do vary from state to state, saying if you have a felony conviction, you may not work in this occupation. For the federal government, it's a lot of interstate commerce kinds of things. At the state level, though, it's often you can't work in a school, can't work in a hospital, can't work in a nursing home. By the way, these are all the sectors where there's a lot of growing employment opportunities. And those do vary from state to state. On top of that, even when the law doesn't prohibit employment, employers do bring these negative attitudes that were clear in the numbers that Michael quoted. Over and above. Now, why are employers so nervous about hiring from this population? Well, first of all, they kind of assume that the performance is going to be bad and that the turnover is going to be high, so they don't want to invest in employees that they're almost certain, a little too certain, or they think are going to turn out to be problematic employees. But on top of that, they have a certain level of fear of this population, rightly or wrongly. They have a certain level of fear. What are they fearful of? They are fearful of conflict. They are fearful of theft. They may even be fearful of physical violence, and that any of those things could be perpetrated not only against them, but against their employees and their customers. And what they really fear in a lot of cases is some kind of being held legally liable for a wrongful hiring of a high-risk person who then does one of this thing. Now, if you look at the facts, you can count maybe on your 2 hands the number of cases, and of course you folks at the law school know this better than I do, the number of cases where this has happened, where an employer has been held legally liable is very, very small. And yet it really animates the employers and it makes them fearful. And a lot of these guys are very risk averse, so they just don't want to go there. And of course it's interesting, so number one, as some of the previous speakers said, most of these guys have one non-violent felony conviction for drug possession or drug sales. There's no history of violence or theft in many of these cases, and yet the employers are still fearful. And of course, the other thing is, EEO law is very clear about this. You may not have a blanket policy that says, I will not hire anyone with a felony conviction. EEO law says if you're not talking about someone in one of those jobs where it's specifically prohibited, you can't have a blanket policy because it has an adverse consequence against black men. You have to look at the nature of the job and the nature of the conviction, and you have to make a case that in that particular case the person doesn't work and the fit doesn't work. But of course we know that law gets ignored a lot, and a lot of employers simply refuse to hire. Another thing, background checks is another burden. It's becoming in the age of the internet. It's become very, very easy. $10, $15, the employer can go online and check whether someone has a criminal record. The accuracy of those records sometimes is questionable. And this is actually an interesting point. Raphael and Stoll and I wrote a few papers on this. A few of our friends on the left got unhappy with us. We actually showed that the effects of that on black male employment are more mixed than you might think. Because if an employer has easy access to criminal records, it does make it easier for them to avoid hiring felons and people with criminal records. It actually raises their tendency to employ black men who don't have criminal records, because it solves that fear problem, what economists call that statistical discrimination. That, oh, now I have evidence that this guy is clean. I don't have to worry about him anymore. And so we are not against these blanket, ban the box and things like that. The question is not whether people have that, whether employers have access to the information. What do they do with it? We think is what matters. But that's been a more mixed bag. Those are all limits on the demand side. And then on the supply side, of course, if you look at some of the charts that Michael presented and some of the history, it's very obvious. Guys get to be their late 20s. They've lost a lot of extra work experience that they otherwise would have gotten had they not been incarcerated. Right off the bat, that's going to make them less employable and less interesting, less competitive employees to a lot of employers. So they bring that. And of course, they are more disconnected from the world of the job market. They have fewer contacts than they had before, fewer positive networks to help them find a job. So on both the demand and supply side, the barriers grow for these guys. And what about the non-custodial parents and the whole child support system? I think these then hurt their employment more on the supply side in terms of incentives to work. Because what happens is, if you have a child support order, especially if you have multiple orders, and especially if you're in arrears, it constitutes a fairly large tax on your earnings. Now, some people say it's not a tax because the money is going to your family. Well, some of it is like a tax. Some of it does go to the government to pay debts, for your family being on public support. If some of the money is going to your ex and relations are bad with your ex, that's going to be viewed as a really negative tax. So the incentives for a lot of these guys are to disappear because they get a paycheck that's this big, and after garnishment for their child support orders and arrears, it's only this big before you even get to taxes. That will discourage them from working. Now, you might say, but there's incentives on the other side, right? If you're in a state where you can get your driver's license suspended or thrown in jail for non-support, at a minimum, that should, and there's problems with those sanctions, that should maybe offset the incentives and make you more interested in working. Well, the net effect then depends on, can you disappear below the radar? And depending on the state you live in some places it's easier to do that than others. If you can disappear below the radar, I think the negative incentives on formal participation in the labor market are much stronger. And that's one more thing. I think that it's not a barrier, but it's a disincentive on top of all the other problems to participating legally. So this is the situation. Folks with weak work experience, with weak skills, and then a whole list of other barriers and disincentives associated with being an NCP and an offender. Okay, so does anything work at helping to solve these problems? These are difficult populations. Once you have these markers and these experiences, it's difficult. But there are some promising results and even some proven results. So what I did, start with disconnected youth. Are the things that improve employment and school outcomes among disconnected youth? And it was very nicely reviewed in a paper by Chris Weimer and Dan Bloom for MDRC. I tried just to list all the programs for which there's been some rigorous evaluation. That usually means a random assignment experiment, what we now call an RCT, and there's been a positive and significant impact. The impact may or may not last. The impact may or may not be cost effective, but you can do something positive. And I tried to write them all down. What you can see here is that it's a lot more effective to try to prevent disconnection than to try to reconnect someone who's already disappeared from these worlds. I have a lot of things listed. I can't talk about every one. I tried to list them in some kind of order. When you think about that progression I mentioned before, first you're at risk of disconnecting, and then you disconnect, and then you're at some risk of becoming an offender or a non-custodial dad. Along that chain, what are the programs that actually have some positive effects that prevent this from happening? So first of all, the first 2 or 3 programs are things that you can start with adolescents. SEL, social emotional learning. There have been some programs incorporating that have been quite positive. Big brother, big sister. Mentoring. Not enormous impacts, but certainly enough to be cost effective. You get to the high school level. Are there certain things that work for this population? Yes. A program called Talent Development. A very important program called Career Academies. Career Academies are what I call modern career and technical education. Not old-fashioned voc ed, which was lousy and nobody wants to go back to that. Modern high-quality career education, which prepares folks for college as well as careers, but gives them a skill and some early labor market experience. The evaluations show that raises the earnings of at-risk young men by as much as 20% and as much as 8 years afterwards. Those are huge impacts in this literature. And it suggests that instead of trying to get everybody to go to college, high-quality career education can give some of these young men options. It doesn't close any other doors. Small schools of choice is another important approach. That's an approach where in New York City, they took these huge factory high schools with enormous dropout rates, and they chopped them up into small schools with particular themes. Some of them were career academies, that had links to labor markets. Some of them had another theme, a writing or a music theme. And then you let people choose which of those themes appeals to them. This had very large positive impacts on graduation rates and some other outcomes. So again, there are things that work. Now, what happens when these folks go to college, and usually a lower tier 4-year college or a community college? And of course, we send a lot of people to college in America. in community college, a lot of low-income people, and the outcomes are often terrible. The vast majority of this population, when they go off to community college, almost immediately they get stuck in remediation, something called developmental education. If you can't pass Algebra 1, or you can't pass some sort of test, whether that test has any predictive power for your future success is often unclear. The remediation is a disaster, and the dropout rates of this population are very, very, and by the way, you're not allowed to take anything for credit. You're not allowed to take a health tech class or to become a phlebotomist unless you pass the test in remediation. And the impacts are really quite negative of that. So are there policies and programs that help that? Probably the best, most promising one, there's a program called ASAP, Accelerated Studies in Associate Programs in CUNY, the CUNY system in New York. And what they did is they took these folks going into developmental education. They said, okay, you got to go full-time. But if you go full-time, we're going to give you a very different academic environment, lots of supports, and we'll see what happens. And no financial burdens at all of going. And the impacts were really large. It raised the college completion rate almost by 100% within this population. Very, very large impacts. And there's lots of other programs. Becoming a Man is a kind of a summer employment plus a little bit of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, that seems to have some impacts, et cetera. And then there's sectoral training, which I really wanted to mention. For people that are all done with schooling, you know, the history of job training is really very weak, you know, when you evaluate its impacts. But there's an approach called sectoral training where you have an intermediary, and they target a certain sector where there's a lot of jobs that don't require a BA, like healthcare and health tech, or IT or advanced manufacturing. And they train people for those jobs. They work hand in hand with the employers to make sure that what they're training them is what the employers want. And of course, they also screen them very carefully. Never send someone to an employer who might be a questionable employee. And this form of training has much larger impacts than the usual job training stuff, and that's gaining ground as well. And we have one of the best sites right here in Milwaukee, the Wisconsin Regional Training Partnership, that some of you might be familiar with, was one of the sites evaluated and had really strong impacts. So there's this whole range of things at all these different stages showing some positive impact when they're rigorously evaluated. Now, if you look at the reconnection literature, folks that have already disconnected, you're trying to reconnect back, the success stories are harder to find. I've listed 4 of them here. The Job Corps being the biggest and most famous of them, but the Job Corps impacts tend to fade. There's some other ones. It's harder and a lot more expensive to successfully reconnect someone. What about folks that have criminal records or that are non-custodial dads? Here, too, there's some interventions that have some positive effects. Transitional jobs. Someone comes out of jail, out of prison, you give them a guaranteed job for 6 to 9 months, paid by someone else to get their feet wet in the job market. Now, transitional jobs turn out to have almost no impact on employability after the job ends, and that's always been disappointing. But some of them, the really good programs, do some other things, like they really reduce recidivism. And it's an expensive intervention, but if the recidivism results hold up, it actually can be cost effective. So that's one thing to look at, and there's a bunch of new evaluations going on transitional jobs that we should pay attention to. There's some other father programs, and I listed here 2 that are quite different. NCP Choices is a Texas program. It's actually not about choices. It's a mandatory work participation program. But it does seem to have quite positive impacts on the men of the program. And then very differently, in the state of New York, under Governor Pataki, there was an earned income tax credit specifically for non-custodial dads who are keeping up with their child support. That also seemed to have some small but positive impacts on employment and on paying your child support. And more broadly, there's growing interest in an earned income tax credit for childless adults who are very often from this population. You don't have custody of a child. So some of those things are moving ahead and I think need to be carefully watched. There are a lot of questions in this regard. The question of for whom? I mean, these programs serve very different populations. The further you go down in the pool in terms of difficulties and barriers, the harder it is for an intervention to work. And yet we do have some decent examples and some decent impacts to study. And of course, the biggest question of all, from a policy point of view, if you're a state or a federal government, can you replicate those successful models and scale them? You know, we always have these little gems that we find, like the Wisconsin Regional Training Partnership. Everybody gets excited. 25, 30 states right now are trying to build large-scale sectoral training programs. Will they be as effective? Will they maintain the same quality? We don't know. And you know, one might not be too optimistic in that regard. Nevertheless, the fact that you have these programs serving these different populations at all these different segments, I think is encouraging. Well, and it suggests what a sort of a broad policy agenda ought to look like, right? You start with prevention. You start with these young men in middle school and high school. You try to keep them on track. You try to keep them from dropping out. And then you try to get them successfully into the labor market as well as you can, and with an appropriate set of skills that the labor market values. If you haven't, if they drop out or then become offenders or non-custodial dads, it's harder. But then again, you have incentive programs that work. You have earned income tax credits. And the last thing you do is public policy can reduce some of the barriers that public policy itself creates in the world of offending and non-custodial parents. So what's happening in the policy world in terms of the federal government, in terms of the state government, that one might call positive? And there are some positive things going on. And I'll start with non-custodial dads, because here, the Obama administration, I think, has done some interesting things in this regard. There is an Office of Child Support Enforcement at HHS. It's run by a woman named Vicki Turetsky, who was a longtime Washington advocate in this area that many of us came to know. And she has been pushing on this single-mindedly. Now remember, you can't do legislation right now. Legislation just isn't going to happen in the federal government. What you can do is create a framework, and they have created this whole family framework. And working with states on that framework to make sure that there's policy pieces that fit with each other. There's a whole bunch of pilot programs that are being evaluated. I think David's program is one of those, the CSPED programs. And most importantly, there's a set of rules, changes in the regs on how these programs are implemented that have been authored by HHS. They've been put out for public comment period's ending, and now the administration is trying, it's in the hands of OMB, how hard the administration is going to push to try to implement these changes. And 4 things, I think, that, I've read over the reg changes, that matter. First of all, how do judges set default orders on non-custodial dads? Should judges assume a certain potential employment, but they have nothing to do with the actual employment circumstance of the man in question, of the father, as David pointed out. A lot of these guys with very, very low earnings under any scenario. And how should those orders be adjusted when the judges have new information about lack of employment? And arrears adjustment, possibility to adjust arrears, certainly the arrears to the state when this new information, adjusting arrears, managing, maybe even forgiving some part of the arrears if current child support payments are going stronger. So there's one set of rule changes on that. Secondly, and I don't think anyone mentioned this before, if you become incarcerated and you have a child support order, the child support clock keeps ticking, at least historically. In other words, a period in prison is regarded as voluntary unemployment. So these men pile up large arrearages while they're sitting in prison. And then when they come out, it makes the barriers that they face even worse. So the rules, and again, states are starting to get rid of this, and states are starting to realize that this is very counterproductive. This rule would make it illegal for states to count time in prison as involuntary unemployment, which I think would be a big plus. Third, there's some changes in the rule on the distribution of funds, how much goes to the state to pay off debts as opposed to the families. And fourthly, rules on employment services that just make it a lot easier for the states to use their funds and use their money for employment support as opposed to strictly to enforcement. So these are the rules. I think these rules would make a difference collectively if the administration decides to or can implement them. In the meantime, a lot of states have been moving in these directions on their own. And that's the positive in this talk, that some states are really starting, and they're red states as well as blue states, starting to realize some of these things are so counterproductive. It serves nobody for these men to have these huge arrearages that then chase them out of the formal labor market. And then they can't pay the child support. This is not a good outcome for anybody. So states are really trying to figure out what is it in their child support regs that is harmful and that leads to bad outcomes rather than good outcomes. And there's a lot of variance across the 50 states, but you see more and more states moving in this direction. On other issues that are positive changes, not as much. I think there is positive movement on high schools and community colleges in terms of trying to expand high-quality career education and sectoral training. Time will tell if those are successful, but I think that's encouraging. You see all across the country partnerships developing between healthcare employers or IT employers and community colleges. Now, always a big question of, do people have the skills necessary to take the classes to get those jobs? But it's a positive step. And on the ex-offender side, I mostly agree with Michael. To the extent there's been any tailing off, it's often due to physical constraints and capacity. But there's a few areas where you see some movement here. You do see some movement on sentencing reform to try to close some of those terrible gaps in drug sentences that send so many men to prison. There is some movement on other approaches, alternatives to incarceration, like drug courts and things like that, to try to keep some, and again, a lot of variance across the states, but you see at least some positive activity in this regard. And on the side of ex-offenders and integrating them, there's EEO activity going on, and there's these ban-the-box initiatives cropping up in cities and states all over the country. And like I said, I have some mixed feelings about this, but I understand the argument for the ban-the-box initiative. Eventually, the employer will find out if someone has a criminal record. The idea of ban-the-box is at least let the guy get his foot in the door and try to make a positive impression. If you ask on an application, have you ever had a record, and then the person turns out to, if they say no, they get fired immediately. If they say yes, often the employer throws the application in the trash. Doesn't even look any further. If you delay where in that process they get that information, sometimes the young man has had time to demonstrate some positive things, some positive experiences, a few jobs that they've successfully held. It might make some positive difference. So there's not as much movement in this area as we hope, but some positive things. And going forward, and this will be my last slide, how do we think about the environment going forward and chances for doing something positive in this realm? There is clearly some downside. I mean, I already talked about the weak job market, and that's going to be a negative, and we're not going to go back to 1999 anytime soon. We don't have policy. We could have done a better job than we did, with all due respect to Paul Krugman, I don't think it would have been quite as easy and as obvious. We could have done some things better, but the job market is going to remain sluggish for a while, and that's going to be a problem. And on top of that, at least at the federal level, the political environment is so poisonous, and the fiscal environment is so challenging with the baby boomers retiring and the pressure from the retirement programs. You're not going to be able to spend much money on any program. There's not going to be a lot of legislative changes at the federal level. The nice thing, by the way, about some of those interventions I reviewed before is a lot of them don't cost that much money. A lot of them is taking the money spent now on students and on training and spending it more intelligently and orienting it more towards job market possibilities. But I still don't expect a lot of legislative changes there. At the state level, there's more possibility because at the state level, people are less ideological. Governors are really tired of these massive incarceration budgets, even Republican governors in red states. At least some of them. Grover Norquist, who, by the way, was my college classmate. It was always interesting when he came and joined you for dinner. There is this very interesting positive development. There's a new conservative politics on incarceration. Conservatives in general are moving against incarceration. I think Charles talked about that. Historically, there were always some pieces of the conservative movement, like the libertarians, who were anti-incarceration, or like the faith-based community that wanted to, redeem these men with some kind of faith-based option. It's gone way beyond that. And I think as Charles said before, a lot of conservative thinkers and policy analysts have woken up and said, geez, we're spending a massive amount of public money essentially to make people unemployable. Does this fit any conservative philosophy that we can think of? And they're saying, no, it doesn't. This is a really counterproductive system. And now I've gone to roundtables at the Heritage Foundation, one of the most conservative think tanks in Washington, where people are sitting around the table saying, we got to do things very differently in this realm. So to me, that's a very positive development. And I think there's a bit of a consensus on fathers that anything we do that makes it harder for them to get jobs is counterproductive. I mean, is it really a good thing to take away someone's driver's license or put them in jail if subsequently it makes it that much harder for them to get work and therefore their family collects less support? So there's a growing awareness, I think, of the irrationality of some of these policies. And you hear possibilities of what you might call a grand bargain between left and right on poverty policy and specifically on offenders and non-custodial dads, saying, number one, we have to do more on employment, even if we have to spend some public resources on that. If it's spent effectively, we should be willing to do that. I think the left is getting more open to talking about marriage. You know, this is something that liberals had to run away from for a long time. Now, we have no evidence of any policy that works successfully to raise marriage rates. A lot of them were piloted in the Bush 43 administration. None of them worked when they were rigorously analyzed. And yet, the conversation continues, and I think people on the left are saying, yeah, you know, there's simply way too many children growing up in single-parent families, and social scientists have argued for 30 or 40 years, is it the single parenthood per se that hurts those kids or other circumstances of the family? I think there's a growing body of evidence that says, yes, the single parenthood per se has a negative effect. Absence of fathers. And by the way, if we lived in Scandinavia, where you have a lot of long-lasting unions between unmarried adults, that'd be fine. You wouldn't need marriage. But in a world in the United States, most unmarried unions don't last. And there's marriage really is the best predictor of a longer-lasting relationship. It's good for the kids. So people on the left, I think, have to be open to those discussions. And if not those things, at least at a minimum, improving contraception access. And there's a very good book that Isabel Sawhill at Brookings just came out with a few months ago, where she makes the case for LARCs, long-acting reversible contraception, basically IUD kinds of things, and that young girls and young women should have much more access, because she documents how so many of these children born outside of marriage were not intended, were not planned. And women get pregnant, they didn't plan to get pregnant, then they kind of go, kind of stumbling into parenthood. And she makes a very compelling case. She doesn't think we're ever going to raise marriage rates. But at a minimum, if we could make it easier for these young women to avoid unplanned pregnancies, that would be a good thing in their lives and in their kids' lives. And there's surprising pushback against that from the right, because they say sometimes these things really are abortions, et cetera, et cetera. And when you can't get all that, at a minimum, good fatherhood policy and good fatherhood programs to eliminate and reduce so many of those barriers, that long, depressing list of things that David talked about in his talk, at least so that policy doesn't contribute to the problem. Policy may not be able to solve the problem, but it shouldn't be making things that much worse. So, when I look at, there's a lot of reasons to be discouraged from these numbers, but there's also a reason to be at least a little bit hopeful when you look at some of the political changes and some of the changing happening in the states. So, for those of you that have spent your careers working on these issues, I salute you for your efforts and hang in there. And we all need to hang in there and keep chipping away at these problems, because under the right circumstances, at least some of them can get better. I'll stop there. Thank you. I think there is time for some questions. Should I invite up some of the other authors, because we didn't have time? If you want to, if there's any questions addressed to the authors, that's fine too. Yes.
First up, I wanted to just say how valuable getting some more insight into what those things, other than just unemployment and some of the things that we sometimes think of that inhibit African American men in certain areas from advancing, particularly the stressors that come in life, and then the incarceration piece. I think that really informs a lot of what that missing piece is, and I've been trying to describe it in certain circles. What's missing in the discussion from trying to find people jobs and encourage good behavior, but it's just there is piling up now. We can see and we can prove that there's just these other unseen things that just affect the situation when you're trying to get people to move into good decision making and into the labor market, so on and so forth. I do want to hear a little bit more about two particular things, about incentives to one, marriage, and also how do we do something about the correction system, because I think there are some policies such as EITC that right now sort of privilege, and you could probably say this about the child support system too, that sort of actually incentivize single parenthood. When you look at sort of the benefits for single parents with multiple children, the maximum benefit is quite a bit higher than just for a single individual. who's working. And then also with corrections, I think one of the things I haven't heard talked about a lot is that, you know, and this is not to be overly conspiracy theorist, but there's a Correction Corporation of America that's sitting on the New York Stock Exchange. And so, you know, I think in that same period, you'd see a shift in how we view government as not just an administrator, but a purchaser of services. So I think those are two things that I'd be interested in.
Yeah, those are both good points. Let me start with the second one first. I mean, there is a lobby and there is a sector that benefits from incarceration, and they have political pull at the state level. The unionized correction workers, the companies that build the prisons, that run the prisons, et cetera, and they have pull, you know, and they do sometimes prevent the weakening of this. I just think that so many other people are starting to see the costs to the state on so many levels of these high incarceration rates that starting to enable them to push against that lobby. But you're right, there are folks. And in a lot of these rural areas, the prison's the largest employer. And, you know, there's no jobs anywhere for sort of folks living there if the prison system were to shrink. So that's problematic. I just see things piling up on the other side that enable them to push against that. The other thing you said, are there incentives in some of these programs and in the tax code that, in some sense, incent against marriage or in favor of having kids? Economists have been aware of what we call marriage penalties for a long time. You know, and a lot of means-tested programs have marriage penalties. That if you stay single and you have kids, you can get a bigger benefit. And then if you marry, your combined income pushes you above those thresholds. It's easy to find those in the code. They're really expensive to close, and the evidence that they affect marital behavior or having children is very low. So it's worth doing in some cases, but you don't want to spend massive resources. And of course, the way to deal with these there's different ways of dealing with the marriage, but one is to sort of not take the benefits away that quickly as people get married, as their incomes grow. It just costs a lot of money to do that. And if it's going to cost a lot of money and it's actually going to have a very small effect on behavior, may not be worth doing. But both worthwhile things to keep in mind, I think. Yes?
Thank you. I'm wondering if you thought about or read about the potential of immigration reform to improve the employment prospects of disadvantaged men, either by improving the conditions in the relatively low-skilled labor market or reducing a readily exploitable subset of people in the labor market.
Well, what's interesting about your question is that you assume that if it has an impact, that it should be positive. There's a lot of people out there that think the opposite. There's a lot of people out there that think, I mean, there's a broader question of, I understand. But your question kind of presupposes, and I agree with you, it's possible that the effects could be positive. Because right now, if people are illegal in the labor market, it's easier for employers to exploit them by paying them sub-market. If they're legal, they have to be paid a market wage or people are going to walk, and that's going to limit. So I think you're right that it quite possibly could reduce negative impacts. But there's also, you know, people are worried about the other thing. People are worried about more immigrants coming in, more illegals. And so part of the question is, how do you implement the program? You know, I think there is a broad literature on has low-skill immigration hurt less educated men, especially African-American men. And as always in economics, you have one set of estimates that say no negative effect at all. Another set of estimates, mostly coming out of Cambridge, Massachusetts, sort of saying, you know, there are some negative effects, and they might be sizable. And I'm sort of somewhere in between. I think there probably are negative effects. I mean, when you look at where I live, I don't know if it's the same in Wisconsin. I have never seen a non-Latino worker on a construction crew in suburban Maryland. I mean, never. Not once. And which doesn't mean that's true of commercial. It doesn't mean it's true in the District of Columbia. When you have that much penetration of immigrants into a sector that might otherwise have created some decent paying jobs for less educated men, that probably has a negative impact. On the other hand, there's other growth effects and other things working the other way that might offset that. In general, I think if immigration reform is implemented correctly, for the reasons you said, it might actually reduce the negative impacts of keeping guys at some market wages, and that should make it not quite as easy. Because employers, you know, if you're a low-wage employer, you love these guys. You know, you pay a really low wage. Native-born anybody doesn't want to touch that job, but immigrants, geez, you know, if you're from Guatemala, you know, a $7 or $8 an hour job is looking pretty good. And if you're being paid in cash, so you don't have to pay taxes, it's looking even better. But there'd be less of that kind of, I think, exploitation if more people were legal. So that's the positive hope. Yes?
You talked a bit about the transitional jobs programs and some of the findings. Were those findings limited to individuals who'd been incarcerated? And
yes. So in other words, the way the evaluation works is you have a population of guys, for instance, in New York, coming out of Rikers Island. And so half of them that's selected for the study get the option of going into a transitional job. And you have to screen out the guys with a drug problem or, with other risky behaviors. And then the other half who volunteer for the program, but you don't give them the access. And then you compare over time what happens to the two. And the really good programs, like there's a program in New York called CEO, you had this finding that the employment effects faded away very fast. So you get a bump to the earnings of the person when they're in the job, and then they get that bump for 2 or 3 quarters, and then they leave the job and the bump disappears fast, discouragingly quickly. And that's been disappointing. But for some reason, that experience keeps them from recidivating. Maybe because you get them in an environment where they can get some supports and get them more integrated into the community and housing and things like that. And the drop, and if recidivation is so expensive just in terms of dollars, that if the recidivism effect lasts over time, that is often enough to make the program cost effective. Now, we're looking to see if there have been other evaluations like that where you don't get the recidivism effect.
Just a quick follow-up in the same vein. Is the drop-off rate as quick for populations that have not been incarcerated but go into transitional jobs? Is there a comparison?
There have been some studies of, for instance, long-term welfare moms back in the 90s. Same thing. So you start with a population of people, all of whom have had the incarceration or all of whom have had the long-term welfare, and then you just follow them to see. And again, the results there are quite mixed. There was one study in Philadelphia where it reduced the recidivism of women back onto welfare. Of course, now it's not a problem because hardly anybody's on welfare anymore. But other studies, it depends a lot. I mean, all these programs depend so heavily on how is the program implemented. And can you maintain the quality that shows up? CEO is the best program, and I know Mindy Tarlow, the woman whose baby that program is, and she's amazing, and she has devoted her entire life to figuring out how to make this thing work, and whether someone else can walk in and replicate that set of strong results is always questionable. And that's, so you find this very mixed record on the transitional jobs programs. But what we always hope is we can figure out what makes the successful ones work, and then see if you can replicate those implementation strategies. What would be best if you could clone Mindy Tarlow, right? And have her, but can't do that, right? So that's often the biggest challenge, even when you identify something that works. Can you replicate it and scale it and maintain some level of the quality that you found in the original program? Yes?
Hi, I represent United Way in our capital city. We're getting ready to deploy a couple $1 million towards poverty, and particularly towards men in poverty. Given the fact that a couple $1 million is nice, but it's not all the money in the world to address the issues that we've talked about here today, where do you think the highest opportunity levers are for us?
Well, I would say, given what the evaluation evidence has shown, spending a small amount of money on prevention will probably get you a bigger return than spending it on transitional jobs or other things like that. And I think going into, if you could spend that money somehow transforming these urban high school factories, into small schools of choice, developing really good, high-quality career and technical education, which, again, doesn't cost that much, and you have to have industry. And Wisconsin actually has a stronger tradition of that because of the technical college system that you have here and things like that. But, reaching some of these kids in high school and identifying the ones who are at risk and getting them kind of the appropriate level of service or letting them choose a curriculum, that might be the highest return thing that you could do with that money, I would think.
Please join me in thanking Carrie Holzer. On behalf of the La Follette School of Public Affairs and this great partnership with Marquette Law School, thank you for a really great morning. I feel like I learned a lot. Let's congratulate our panel one more time, and thank you.
Thank you.
we're going to do some follow-up and make sure all of you have some additional information about both the La Folla School and the Marquette Law School. Thank you for coming.